You drift above a river city of lamps. Avignon hums below. Ledgers whisper. Seals cool in red wax. And a pope far from Rome weighs the price of safety. Across the map, dawn breaks on Friday the 13th. Doors splinter. White mantles are dragged into the street. And the Knights Templar learn that chains move faster than rumors. In a fortress called Chinon, parchment will answer pain. At Vienne, a council will end an order with a sentence. And years later, 2 lamps will burn at once, one in Rome, one by the Rhone, each claiming to be the only light. This is how a church splits, how a river can carry power from one bank to another, and how politics, as quiet as a clerk's quill, can outlast any sword. Tonight, we follow the keys through fog and fire to the moment the world spoke of the Papal Schism that destroyed the Templars. Not by blade, but by bulls and seals, by the slow turning of institutions that close like iron. If slow burn history helps you unwind, stay with me. Tap subscribe so you don't miss the next night's journey. Leave a like to keep these lamps burning. And tell me in the comments which moment you want us to linger on. The arrests at dawn, the parchment at Chinon, or the night 2 popes lit rival candles. Breathe in the dust of 1303 Anagni. A tiara tilts, a door crashes, and the wind begins to change. The story of the Avignon Papacy does not begin with a relocation decree or a building plan. It begins with humiliation, swift, public, and unshakable. In early September of 1303, Pope Boniface VIII, already engaged in a bitter struggle with King Philip IV of France, was in his family's hometown of Anagni, southeast of Rome. For years, tensions between the French crown and the papacy had risen over issues of taxation, clerical immunity, and the question of ultimate authority in Christendom. Boniface was not a man to yield lightly. His bulls proclaimed the supremacy of the spiritual sword over the temporal, and his tone carried the old confidence of popes who had made emperors kneel in the snow. Philip, equally unyielding, had the machinery of a powerful and wealthy kingdom at his back. When diplomacy failed, both men turned to weaponized rhetoric, accusations of heresy, charges of corruption. By the late summer of 1303, Philip's advisors, notably Guillaume de Nogaret, sought a decisive blow. They orchestrated a daring move: seize the Pope in his own residence, force his abdication, and clear the way for a more compliant successor. The attack came suddenly. On September 7th, Nogaret, allied with members of the Colonna family, rivals of Boniface, entered Anagni with armed men. The city's narrow lanes, built for mules and processions, funneled the force straight toward the papal palace. Chroniclers record shouts, blows against wooden doors, and the panic of courtiers who fled through side passages. Boniface, in his chamber, donned full pontifical regalia, as if for mass, seating himself on the papal throne, with the triple tiara crowning his head. What happened next has been told in tones of outrage and relish for 7 centuries. One version, repeated by later writers, claims that Sciarra Colonna struck the Pope across the face, a gesture forever known as the slap of Anagni. Whether the slap actually occurred is debated, but the symbolism was too rich for history to let go. The image of a pontiff, God's vicar, physically assaulted by agents of a secular monarch, marked a rupture in medieval ideas of papal inviolability. Boniface was held captive for 3 days. Anagni's townspeople, initially complicit or cowed, turned against the intruders and freed the Pope. But the damage was done. Weakened physically and emotionally, Boniface returned to Rome only to die within a month, on October 11, 1303. His successor, Benedict XVI, attempted a brief reconciliation with France, but died within the year, rumors of poisoning adding to the drama. The deeper wound was to the papacy's prestige. The Anagni incident demonstrated that force could reach the Holy See, that the Pope's person was not beyond the grasp of royal arms. For the kings of Europe, especially Philip IV, the episode proved that the papacy could be pressured into compliance, or at least into caution. For the College of Cardinals, it was a stark reminder that their choice of pope could provoke or prevent such crises. When the conclave met in 1305, political reality weighed heavily. The choice fell on Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux, who took the name Clement V French by birth. With ties to Philip, yet not his obvious creature, Clement promised stability. Rome, still unstable and scarred by factional violence, offered no gentle welcome. And so, without ever setting foot in the city as pope, Clement steered the papal court towards safer harbors. Anagni thus stands as the overture to a century-long shift. The cracked dignity of Boniface's tiara became a metaphor for the papacy's altered stance, still potent in doctrine, but newly aware of the reach of secular power. It also foreshadowed a change in the very geography of papal rule. If the pope could be seized in his palace, then perhaps the palace should move. And here lies the subtle bridge to Avignon. The Rhone's banks offered a strategic midpoint between Italy and France, accessible yet defensible. Clement's decision in 1309 to settle there would be framed in terms of safety and order, but the shadow of Anagni lingered in every brick and every guarded gate. The move was not merely a change of address, it was a recalibration of power, informed by the memory of armed men climbing palace stairs. The slap, real or imagined, remained a specter in curial politics. It whispered in the council chambers when popes weighed whether to confront monarchs. It hardened the resolve of those who believed that proximity to France could shield the papacy from Rome's turbulence. And it lived on in art and chronicle, a small act inflated into a symbol of the age's shifting balance. In the centuries that followed, Anagni would be remembered less for its sunny piazzas and more for that September evening. The palace still stands, its stones holding the echo of hurried steps, its windows looking out over a landscape unchanged in form but altered forever in meaning. The Rhone's waters were already flowing toward the story, carrying with them the lesson that authority, once struck, must choose whether to retreat, rebuild, or relocate. As the sun sets on Anagni in the mind's eye, we follow the current downstream, not in haste, but with the steady rhythm of history's long pulse. The papacy will next anchor itself in a walled city by the river, where candles burn behind high stone and ledgers grow thick. The tiara, though dented, will be set again on another's brow, and the journey from humiliation to adaptation will begin. When Bertrand de Got emerged from the conclave of 1305 as Pope Clement V, the papal tiara was not yet warm upon his head before the weight of his election pressed in. He was a Frenchman, born near Bordeaux, a city with its own divided loyalties between the French crown and the English kings who still held territories in Aquitaine. His elevation had been engineered in part by King Philip IV of France, though the cardinals had tried to strike a balance, a man close enough to Philip to secure peace, yet not so obviously pliable as to appear a puppet. Clement faced a city he would never truly rule, Rome, before he even reached it. the Eternal City was anything but serene. Rival noble families like the Colonna and Orsini battled for dominance, or Cawanan d'Orsini Saldao met. Mercenary bands roamed the countryside, and the memory of Boniface VIII's humiliation at Anagni still hung like a pall over curial politics. Rome's streets could turn violent on a rumor. Its factions, armed and entrenched, could endanger a pontiff's life as surely as any foreign army. There was also the practical question of coronation. Instead of traveling directly to Rome, Clement arranged for his coronation in Lyon in November 1305, a location both accessible to the French court and symbolically acceptable to the Church. From there, his journey toward Rome seemed to slow and then stop entirely. The reasons were a tapestry of caution, convenience, and political reality. In 1309, Clement made a decisive choice. He would establish the papal court in Avignon, a modest city on the Rhone River within the Comtat Venaissin, territory that, while not formally part of France, lay firmly within its cultural and political orbit. Avignon was technically under the suzerainty of the King of Naples, who at that time was also Count of Provence, but the French crown's influence in the region was undeniable. The city's location offered several advantages. It was well connected by river and road, close to the papal ally King Philip, and far from the unstable politics of Rome. The move was not initially presented as permanent. Clement described it as a practical relocation for the sake of safety and effective governance. Yet the symbolism of the decision was not lost on observers. A pope had chosen to reside outside Rome, not in temporary exile, as past pontiffs had occasionally done, but in a sustained presence that would grow into a century-long papal residency. The Babylonian captivity of the papacy, as Petrarch would later call it, began here, though no one in 1309 could yet know how enduring it would be. Avignon itself was not yet the grand papal fortress it would become. The Palais des Papes was still decades away from its monumental expansion under later popes. Clement's court occupied existing buildings, adapting them to serve the needs of the Curia. The city's streets were narrow, its houses clustered around the looming bulk of the Cathedral of Notre-Dame-des-Doms. The Rhone flowed beside it, wide and slow, its stone bridge, the Pont Saint-Benezet, only partially complete even then, a reminder that connections could be as fragile as they were necessary. For Clement, the Rhone was more than a geographic convenience. It was a political moat. It placed him at a safe remove from the incessant demands of Roman factions and the dangers of Italian warfare, yet close enough to Italy to exert influence. It allowed him to manage the Church's affairs with a stable administrative base, secure communications, and the physical safety of his person and court. Critics, however, saw something different. To many Italians, especially the Romans, the papacy's heart had been displaced. They argued that the Bishop of Rome should reside in Rome, that the authority of the see was tied not only to doctrine, but to the city that had been the center of the Christian world since antiquity. The absence of the Pope from Rome would have consequences for the city's economy, prestige, and political balance. Clement's relocation also signaled a shift in the papacy's political alliances. While still claiming universal authority, the papal court's proximity to France could not help but favor French influence in ecclesiastical appointments, policy decisions, and diplomatic initiatives. The perception of a French papacy began here, seated in the pragmatic decision to settle on the Rhone. From the moment the papal court arrived, Avignon began to change. The influx of clerics, administrators, ambassadors, and merchants transformed the city's scale and rhythm. Taverns and hostels multiplied. Scribes and notaries found steady work. The cathedral saw processions of cardinals in crimson robes. The court's appetite for goods, wine, parchment, spices, stimulated trade. Avignon's population grew, and with it, the infrastructure to support a more permanent papal presence. Clement himself remained a cautious, measured figure. He avoided unnecessary entanglements in Roman politics, preferring to focus on administrative order and the resolution of ongoing disputes, one of the most prominent being the trial of the Templars. His location in Avignon gave him both the proximity to Philip IV, whose will was entwined with the prosecution of the order, and the distance to manage the trial with a semblance of independence. Yet the shadow of Anagni followed him. His choice of Avignon can be read as a strategic lesson learned from Boniface VIII's fate. Never place the papacy where it can be cornered by enemies, whether those enemies wear armor or silk robes. The Rhone, with its broad waters and political buffer, offered a sense of security that Rome simply could not in the volatile early 14th century. In time, Clement's decision would be seen not as a temporary measure, but as the foundation of an era. The papacy would remain in Avignon through the reigns of 7 popes, from 1309 until 1377, during which it developed sophisticated administrative systems, expanded its fiscal reach, and navigated the treacherous waters of European politics from behind its fortified walls. The first stones of that legacy were laid in Clement's quiet but transformative choice. As for Rome, its streets would go on without the daily procession of the papal court. Pilgrims still came to venerate relics and saints, but the Pope's absence left a vacuum that others, noble families, mercenary captains, and local clergy, would fill. The city's connection to the papacy became a matter of claim and tradition rather than living presence. Standing at the river's edge in Avignon today, one can imagine Clement's arrival. Barges tied to the banks, the scent of wet stone and wine barrels, the banners of cardinals' retinues stirring in the wind. Across the water, the low hills of Villeneuve glimmer in the Provençal light. The bridge reaches only part way across, as if the rest is left for history to complete. And indeed, the rest of this story will carry us from these waters toward trials, councils, and the long road back to Rome. When Pope Clement V first arrived in Avignon in 1309, the city was still a modest Provençal settlement, with no hint that it would one day rival the Vatican in its ceremonial gravity. The papal court, though smaller than it would become, still demanded a degree of space and security that Avignon's existing structures struggled to provide. The bishop's residence near the Cathedral of Notre-Dame-des-Doms became the immediate seat of papal authority, but it was a far cry from the sprawling complexes of Lateran or Vatican tradition. What Clement began, practical, understated, would be transformed under his successors into a monument of stone and mortar, an architectural expression of the Avignon papacy's reach and permanence. The Palais des Papes would rise in stages, each edition reflecting not just the needs of governance, but the ambitions and anxieties of those who wore the tiara. The first significant phase came under Pope Benedict XIII, 1334-1342, a man whose monastic background inclined him toward order and durability. The Avignon court had already grown into a labyrinth of clerks, auditors, and envoys. The bishop's palace, with its modest chambers, was inadequate. Benedict commissioned a fortress palace, high walls, massive towers, and narrow windows, capable of withstanding siege. The decision to fortify was as much about symbolism as security. Avignon's walls would declare to all who approached that the Pope was not in exile, but enthroned, and that his authority had physical weight in the landscape. The construction was ambitious. Thick limestone blocks were quarried and hauled up from the banks of the Rhone. Local masons worked alongside craftsmen brought from other regions, their techniques blending Provençal style with the severe lines of military architecture. The result was the Old Palace, a structure that could host liturgies in its chapel one day and repel armed men the next. Its walls were not just defensive. They contained the machinery of papal governance, archives, treasury, and the administrative offices that kept Christendom's sprawling affairs in motion. Benedict's successor, Pope Clement VI, 1342–1352, had a different temperament. Where Benedict was austere, Clement VI was a patron of art and ceremony. He expanded the palace into the New Palace, adding grand reception halls, intricate frescoes, and larger chapels. Clement's Avignon became not just an administrative center, but a cultural hub, attracting artists, musicians, and scholars. Under his direction, the palace reflected a papacy that, though far from Rome, could match or exceed the splendor of any court in Europe. Inside, the chambers were carefully arranged to reflect hierarchy and function. The consistory hall, where the Pope met with cardinals, was vaulted and richly painted, a deliberate reminder that decisions made there carried both spiritual and temporal weight. The papal apartments combined modest private rooms with more elaborate public spaces, balancing the Pope's monastic heritage with his role as the center of a vast bureaucracy. Kitchens and storerooms supplied the constant flow of banquets and audiences, while the papal library began to accumulate manuscripts from across Europe and beyond. The palace's chapels, particularly the Grande Chapelle and the Saint Martial Chapel, became showcases for Gothic art. Frescoes covered the walls, depicting saints, biblical scenes, and symbolic motifs that linked the papacy's mission to the history of salvation. In these painted narratives, one could read subtle affirmations that Avignon was not a lesser Rome, but an equal stage for divine authority. Beyond the palace walls, Avignon itself transformed under the papal presence. Streets were paved, markets expanded, and new housing quarters developed for the swelling population of curial staff, merchants, and visiting dignitaries. The city's fortifications were improved, and bridges, though still incomplete, were maintained to ensure connection across the Rhone. Inns catered to pilgrims and envoys. Vineyards flourished to supply the papal table with the renowned wines of the Rhone Valley. Still, the palace's military character could not be ignored. Its towers bore names that reflected both function and symbolism. Tour de Truyas for the prison, Tour de la Garde for watch and defense. The blending of sacred and martial architecture spoke to the papacy's unique position, a spiritual office in a world where swords were never far from the altar. The design also addressed a constant undercurrent of fear of siege from hostile powers, fear of internal unrest, and fear, perhaps, of the very vulnerability exposed at Anagni. The presence of the palace altered diplomatic life in Europe. Kings and princes now sent envoys not to Rome, but to Avignon. Negotiations over bishoprics, disputes between monastic orders, and appeals from secular rulers all passed through its halls. The physical space of the palace became synonymous with papal decision-making. Its gates marked the threshold between the outer world and the concentrated authority within. Critics saw in the fortress-like walls a reflection of the papacy's detachment. The building seemed to embody a church turned inward, more concerned with protecting its wealth and prerogatives than with pastoral outreach. Supporters countered that in an age of political volatility and war, such fortifications were necessary to preserve the independence of the Holy See. Over time, the palace came to represent both the strengths and contradictions of the Avignon papacy. It was a marvel of organization, a secure administrative center, and a beacon of cultural achievement. Yet it was also a reminder that the papacy had chosen distance from its traditional seat, wrapping itself in stone against the world. The palace could host sumptuous banquets while outside its gates, the river carried news of plague, war, and unrest. By the mid-14th century, the Palais des Papes dominated Avignon's skyline. Its sheer size and the clang of its bells were daily reminders to the city's inhabitants that they lived under the shadow of one of Europe's most potent institutions. Visitors arriving by river could see its walls long before they heard the street vendors calling in the markets. The construction, decoration, and operation of the palace employed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people over the decades. Masons, carpenters, painters, scribes, cooks, guards, and clerks. Each contributed to the functioning of this papal citadel. Its archives grew thick with papal bulls, financial records, and diplomatic correspondence. Within those documents lay the decisions that shaped the fate of kingdoms, orders, and individual souls. From the moment Benedict XIV laid its first great walls to the embellishments of Clement VI and later popes, the palace was more than a residence. It was a statement. The papacy could flourish outside Rome, command obedience, and project majesty from the banks of the Rhone. Whether that projection was a triumph of adaptation or a symptom of exile would be debated for centuries. As the Rhone slid past the city's base, its waters reflected the pale stone of the palace walls, shimmering in the sunlight, darkening in the evening. The bridge still reached only partway into the river, as if suggesting that the papacy's journey was also incomplete. The palace stood secure, but its location remained a question that would one day demand an answer. That answer, like the bridge, would require crossing waters not yet fully spanned. When the papacy settled in Avignon, it brought with it not only the ceremonial trappings of authority, but also the machinery of administration. In an era when wars were constant and politics costly, the financial backbone of the Holy See became both its shield and its lightning rod. The popes of Avignon, beginning with Clement V and expanding under his successors, honed fiscal practices that would both stabilize their governance and provoke criticism from across Christendom. At the heart of this system were annates, sometimes called first fruits. Traditionally, when a cleric received a new benefice, an ecclesiastical office with income attached, he paid the first year's revenue to Rome as a form of tax. Under the Avignon popes, this practice expanded dramatically. No longer confined to certain offices or regions, annates became a regularized, systematized source of papal income. The sums flowed steadily to Avignon's treasuries, recorded in the meticulous ledgers of the Apostolic Camera, the papal financial office. These ledgers were more than simple account books. They were vast, carefully organized tomes, bound in leather, and filled with fine Gothic script. Every payment, Every dispensation, every fee for confirming a bishop's appointment or granting a legal exemption found its way into these pages. The papal chancery and camera developed a bureaucracy that rivaled any royal court in Europe, staffed by clerks whose daily labor transformed theology and governance into lines of ink and columns of figures. Alongside annates, the popes expanded their use of reservations, the practice of reserving to themselves the right to appoint to certain church offices. By controlling appointments, they could ensure both loyalty and revenue. Appointees often paid servitia, large fees upon receiving their office, ostensibly to support the papal administration, but also to replenish the coffers strained by diplomatic campaigns, building projects, and the sheer cost of maintaining a court. For the popes, these measures made sense. The Avignon Papacy was a centralizing force in an age of fragmentation. Without predictable income, the Church's ability to arbitrate disputes, mediate between kingdoms, and maintain its independence from secular rulers would have been dangerously undermined. The papal palace itself, its construction, decoration, and maintenance, depended on steady revenue streams. The scribes, messengers, and legal experts who formed the papacy's administrative heart needed salaries. The courts of Europe expected lavish diplomatic receptions, not frugality. Yet to many outside Avignon, the financial reach of the papacy seemed excessive, even exploitative. Critics charged that the Pope's fiscal agents drained local churches to feed the distant court's appetite. Monasteries and parish priests complained of heavy levies. Lay rulers sometimes bristled at the outflow of wealth from their realms. The perception of a moneyed papacy, more banker than shepherd, took root, especially in Italy, where resentment of Avignon's distance already ran deep. Some of the criticism came in the form of satire and invective. Chroniclers and poets described the papal court as a place where coins clinked more loudly than church bells, where petitions succeeded or failed according to the weight of the purse. Petrarch, who spent time in Avignon, famously likened it to a new Babylon, its air thick with greed as well as sin. While such portrayals were often exaggerated, they captured a real unease about the growing entanglement of spiritual authority with fiscal mechanisms. Still, the system worked, at least in terms of stability. Under the Avignon popes, the Church maintained a level of administrative coherence that allowed it to weather crises, from wars between Christian monarchs to the devastation of the Black Death. When the plague struck in 1348, killing perhaps half the population of Avignon, the papal treasury was one of the few institutions able to mobilize resources quickly for relief and for the care of the sick and dying. The camera's records from this period reveal a fascinating detail. Even in plague years, the flow of revenue to Avignon continued, though interrupted in some regions. Dispensation fees, indulgences, and the sale of certain privileges remained sources of income. This resilience reinforced the view among papal officials that centralization was the key to enduring governance, whatever the moral qualms it provoked. Inside the Palais des Papes, the rooms that housed the camera and chancery were as secure as any treasure vault. Chests bound with iron bands stored coin and bullion. Tables were stacked with parchment rolls. Scribes worked by the light of tall candles, their quills whispering across the surface. Wax seals, each with the Pope's insignia, closed documents that might travel for weeks before reaching distant dioceses. The seal was more than ornament. It was the symbol that turned paper into law, a visible reminder that authority emanated from a single center. The concentration of fiscal and administrative power in Avignon also had unintended political effects. In regions where the Pope's favor was vital, rulers sometimes courted the papal court with financial generosity, hoping to secure advantageous appointments or rulings. Conversely, those out of favor might find their requests delayed or denied, another cause for murmured accusations of partiality. The intertwining of finance and diplomacy was nothing new, but the Avignon court gave it a level of institutional polish that impressed even its detractors. Not all income came from ecclesiastical sources. The Avignon papacy also benefited from tributary arrangements with certain territories and from fees associated with arbitration between secular rulers. Papal mediation could avert war, and when it did, the grateful parties often expressed that gratitude in tangible form. In other cases, the mere initiation of a mediation process meant the papal court collected administrative fees. To modernize, the scale of this bureaucracy may seem inevitable, but in the 14th century, it represented a profound shift. The papacy was no longer simply a spiritual leader, but the head of an international administrative machine. Every benefice, every dispensation, every ecclesiastical lawsuit passed through its system, each leaving a financial trace. The very ledgers that recorded these transactions have survived in surprising numbers, allowing historians to reconstruct the rhythms of the Avignon court in remarkable detail. They tell of years when income soared with peace, and years when it dipped during war, of the ebb and flow of influence across regions, and of the steady handwriting of clerks who must have known that their work, though prosaic, was the skeleton that held the body of the Church upright. By the time the Avignon papacy reached its zenith in the mid-14th century, its financial system was admired for its efficiency and resented for its reach. The tension between necessity and perception would persist, shaping the way later critics framed the papacy's role in European affairs. Outside the palace, the Rhone flowed as it always had, indifferent to the careful columns of numbers penned in candlelit rooms. The bridge across it still stopped short, a silent metaphor for a church that had extended its reach into every parish yet remained at a remove from its own ancient seat. The ledgers would grow heavier, the seals more numerous, but the question, whether authority was strengthened or compromised by such fiscal centralization, would linger. Carried on the current toward trials and schisms yet to come. Dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, broke quietly over France. The mist lay low in the river valleys, clinging to the fields and villages, while in the towns, doors creaked open to the sounds of merchants setting out their goods. But across the kingdom, in commanderies and fortified houses belonging to the Knights Templar, a different kind of awakening took place. The king's orders had gone out in secrecy days before, sealed and delivered to local officials with instructions not to open them until the appointed hour. When they did, the words inside were precise and uncompromising. Arrest every Templar, seize their properties, and secure their records. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, had moved with calculated swiftness. The Templars were a military order with roots in the Crusades, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and long celebrated for their martial discipline and service to Christendom. But they were also bankers to kings, custodians of treasure, and owners of estates scattered across Europe. By 1307, their role as a fighting force had diminished with the loss of the Holy Land, and their prominence in finance and administration made them both useful and vulnerable. Philip's motivations were as layered as they were ruthless. He was deeply in debt to the Templars, the legacy of wars with England and the costs of his own court. To eliminate the debt and to assert royal authority over a powerful transnational institution was an irresistible combination. Yet a straightforward seizure of their assets would have invited universal outrage, unless it could be justified under the guise of heresy and moral corruption. In the months before the arrests, whispers had been encouraged, perhaps even planted, about strange rites within the order. Allegations ranged from denying Christ to spitting on the cross during secret initiations, from idol worship to unnatural acts between brothers of the order. These charges, lurid and sensational, provided the perfect pretext for a purge. Whether Philip believed them or merely found them convenient remains one of the enduring questions of medieval history. The coordination of the arrests was itself a feat of administration. Royal officials and loyal knights rode out under cover of darkness to their assigned targets. At dawn, they struck, banging on gates, presenting the king's warrant, and taking the brothers into custody. Templar leaders, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were seized in Paris. Across the realm, hundreds of men were bound and transported to prisons, their possessions inventoried and sealed. The surprise was total. The Templars had no standing army in France capable of resisting such a sweep. Their reputation for martial skill was rooted in the battlefields of the Levant, not in the defense of their scattered European holdings. In many places they surrendered without a fight, stunned and bewildered. The swiftness of the action ensured that messages could not be sent ahead to warn others or secure sensitive documents. Initial interrogations began almost immediately. Philip's agents, working in concert with sympathetic inquisitors, applied the methods sanctioned for rooting out heresy. Torture was permitted under certain conditions, and it was used liberally. The strappado, hoisting a prisoner by ropes tied behind his back, then letting him drop suddenly, was a common tool of the period, and its effects were as much psychological as physical. Under such conditions, many Templars confessed to the charges, though some later recanted. News of the arrest traveled quickly, carried by both official proclamations and rumor. In Rome, Pope Clement V was caught off guard. He had not authorized the sweep, and the suddenness of Philip's move placed him in a difficult position. Publicly opposing the king could fracture relations with France. Endorsing the arrests without independent investigation risked undermining papal authority and due process. Outside France, reactions varied. In some regions, local rulers hesitated to act without papal direction. In others, the charges were met with skepticism. How could an order that had served Christendom so long suddenly be guilty of such grotesque crimes? Yet the spectacle of a king moving decisively against a once mighty order carried its own momentum. By early 1308, similar arrests had been made in other territories, though not always with the same intensity or thoroughness as in France. The events of October 13, 1307 would resonate far beyond their immediate impact. The date itself became a marker in popular imagination, later tangled with superstition about Friday the 13th, though the association is a much later invention. In the 14th century, the significance lay in the demonstration of royal power over a religious military order that, in theory, owed allegiance only to the Pope. For the Templars, that morning was the beginning of the end. Their wealth, once a symbol of their efficiency and reach, became the very reason for their undoing. The records seized by Philip's agents provided lists of properties, inventories of treasure, and details of financial arrangements, information that would be used to dismantle their network and redirect their assets to the crown or, officially, to other orders like the Hospitallers. Yet it was not only gold and land that were seized. The Templars' reputation, painstakingly built over nearly 2 centuries, was taken from them in a single coordinated act. Public perception shifted quickly under the weight of accusations and confessions, however coerced. Once suspicion took root, even their storied past could not shield them. The arrests also set in motion a complex legal battle between Philip and Clement V, as the Pope sought to assert his right to judge the order's fate. This tug of war would play out over the next several years, intertwining with larger questions about the balance of power between crown and papacy. The memory of Anagni was still fresh enough that Clement moved cautiously, unwilling to provoke Philip too directly, yet determined to prevent the king from unilaterally destroying an order under papal jurisdiction. In the weeks following the arrests, prisoners were moved, interrogations repeated, and inventories compiled. Some Templars, broken by their treatment, affirmed every charge. Others stood firm in denial, even under pain. Outside the prisons, the ordinary rhythms of medieval life went on. Markets bustled, harvests were gathered. But the spectacle of the Templars' fall was never far from conversation. In retrospect, the arrests of 1307 stand as a turning point not only in the history of the order, but in the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority. The image of a king's will, executed in near-perfect secrecy across an entire realm, sent a message to every institution, religious or otherwise, about the reach of royal power. For the papacy, it was a reminder that control over the Church's military orders was not absolute when kings were willing to act unilaterally. The mists of that October morning have long since lifted, but the memory remains fixed in the chronicles, a day when knights in white mantles were led away in chains, when the crack of boots on stone echoed in commanderies from Paris to the provinces, and when the first act of a long trial began. From here, the story would move into interrogation chambers and papal courts, where the fate of the Templars would be argued not with swords, but with parchments, seals, and the testimony of men under strain. The arrests of October 1307 had swept the Templars from their commanderies into the custody of the French crown, but the true battle was only beginning. If King Philip IV was to justify the seizure of the order's wealth and extinguish its existence, he needed more than possession. He needed proof. Proof in the early 14th century meant confession, preferably in the accused's own words, and ideally corroborated by multiple witnesses. The stage for this proof was not a battlefield, but the dim, airless rooms where interrogators and prisoners faced one another across tables or ropes. The process unfolded under the dual authority of royal officers and inquisitors. In France, the Inquisition had a long history of prosecuting heresy, and its methods were well established. A suspect would be questioned repeatedly, with scribes present to record every answer in painstaking detail. Officially, torture was permitted only when there was a vehement presumption of guilt, and the accused had refused to confess voluntarily. In practice, the threshold for such presumption could be low, especially when political urgency pressed upon the proceedings. The most common form of coercion was the strappado. The prisoner's hands were bound behind his back, and he was hoisted by a rope attached to a pulley. At a signal, he would be dropped abruptly, stopping short before hitting the floor. The wrenching of shoulders and the shock of the fall caused excruciating pain without necessarily leaving permanent marks. A crucial point for interrogators who wanted visible confessions, but not obvious evidence of abuse. Other methods included the rack, where limbs were stretched beyond endurance, and the application of heated irons, though these were less frequently documented in the Templar trials. It was under such conditions that many Templars confessed to the charges laid against them. They admitted to spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies, to denying Christ, to engaging in illicit practices. Some spoke of a mysterious head or idol venerated in secret, a detail that would later become one of the most notorious elements of the accusations. These confessions, written down by clerks, carried the authority of sworn testimony, though the circumstances under which they were obtained were far from free. Not all confessions were extracted through direct torture. The threat alone could be enough to break a man's resolve. Isolation, deprivation, and the knowledge that others had already confessed often combined to create a sense of inevitability. In some cases, prisoners may have reasoned that admitting to the charges, however falsely, would bring swifter release or more tolerable conditions. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, initially confessed under pressure in Paris, acknowledging some of the charges. Yet he, like others, later recanted, declaring that he had spoken falsely to save himself from suffering. His shifting statements illustrate the tangled nature of the evidence. Truth, coercion, and survival instinct intertwined until they could no longer be separated. The papal response to these proceedings was cautious. Pope Clement V, though nominally in charge of the investigation into the Templars, had been bypassed in the initial arrests. Now he sought to reassert control, requesting that the accused be transferred to ecclesiastical custody for examination by papal commissioners. In theory, this would allow for a more impartial inquiry. In reality, the machinery of royal justice had already ground into motion, and reversing its effects was no simple matter. The role of the written record in this process cannot be overstated. In an age before printing, each confession had to be carefully copied and authenticated, often in duplicate or triplicate, to be sent to various authorities. Scribes labored over these documents in cramped script, sealing them with wax to prevent tampering. These records would later serve as the foundation for the dissolution of the order, cited in councils and read aloud in public as irrefutable proof of guilt. Yet even among contemporaries, doubts arose about the validity of such confessions. Some clerics argued that testimony given under torture was inherently unreliable. Others pointed out inconsistencies between different prisoners' accounts, details that did not align, timelines that contradicted one another. But in the climate of the time, with a powerful king pressing his case and a pope wary of open conflict, such doubts rarely found a public platform. The conditions in which the Templars were held were grim. Many were confined in damp, unlit cells. Some were chained to the walls or floors. Food was basic and sometimes withheld as a form of pressure. Disease spread easily in the overcrowded prisons, further weakening the prisoners' bodies and minds. For men who had once lived under a strict but disciplined monastic rule, with regular prayers, communal meals, and martial training, The abrupt shift to isolation and squalor must have been profoundly disorienting. In some regions outside France, the approach was less severe. In England, for example, the Templars were arrested more slowly and treated with more restraint, with little use of torture. This led to fewer confessions and a more cautious progression of the trials. But it was the French proceedings, with their volume of confessions, that dominated the narrative and shaped the outcome for the entire order. The idol described in some confessions became an object of fascination. Some spoke of a bearded head, others of a figure adorned with precious metals. Historians have since debated whether these were garbled descriptions of relics, symbolic objects used in ceremonies, or pure invention under duress. Whatever its origin, the image of the Templars as secret idolaters took hold in the popular imagination and has never entirely faded. As the months wore on, the accumulation of confessions gave the king and his allies a formidable body of evidence, on paper at least. In public readings, the shocking nature of the alleged crimes stirred outrage. Few lay people heard the circumstances under which these admissions were made. They heard only that knights once sworn to defend the faith had betrayed it in the most blasphemous ways. For the Templars themselves, the confession rooms and chains marked the passage from dignity to degradation. Their fate no longer rested in their swords or in the vows they had taken in the Holy Land, but in the ink-stained hands of scribes and the political calculations of men far above them, sealed at last by the red wax of seals that could ruin a name. By early 1308, the stage was set for the next phase, a papal inquiry that might confirm or challenge the royal narrative. But the momentum lay with Philip. The confessions, however tainted, provided the appearance of guilt. The prisons remained full, and the chains, literal and figurative, kept the order from mounting any effective defense. In the dim light of the interrogation chambers, history shifted on its axis. What began as a dawn raid in October had become a sustained campaign to erase an institution. By early 1308, the keys were pulled from royal jails into papal hands. A commission would convene at a riverside fortress called Chinon. There, in cool stone rooms, parchment would try to speak back to chains. By 1308, the mass arrests of the Knights Templar in France had achieved King Philip IV's immediate goal. The order was immobilized, its leadership in chains, its reputation shaken by public confessions. Yet the question of who had the right to judge them, pope or king, remained unresolved. Philip had acted unilaterally in 1307, but the Templars were a religious order, subject in theory to papal authority. Pope Clement V, faced with a fait accompli, began maneuvering to reclaim control over the process. The key step was to conduct a papal inquiry, independent of the French crown, into the order's alleged crimes. In the summer of 1308, Clement dispatched 3 cardinals, Berenger Fredol, Etienne de Suisy, and Landolfo Brancaccio, to the Château de Chinon in the Touraine region of France. There, in the castle's thick-walled halls, the cardinals would meet with the highest-ranking Templar leaders still alive: Jacques de Molay, Grand Master; Geoffroy de Charnay, Preceptor of Normandy; Hugues de Perrot, Visitor of France; and Geoffroy de Gonville, Preceptor of Aquitaine. The proceedings at Chinon were conducted with the formality befitting a papal commission. The cardinals carried Clement's explicit instructions to examine the charges, hear the accused without undue coercion, and determine whether the order's sins, if proven, were beyond absolution. In the dim chambers of the fortress, the 4 Templar leaders were brought before the commission, each in turn, their chains a visible reminder of their captivity, but their voices recorded with care. The surviving document from these sessions, the Chinon parchment, remained hidden in the Vatican archives for centuries before its rediscovery in 2001. Written in precise Latin, it records a remarkable outcome. The papal commissioners absolved the leaders from heresy. They acknowledged that certain irregular practices had occurred within the order, spitting near a cross, during initiation, for instance, but accepted the explanation that these acts were symbolic tests of loyalty, not genuine denials of Christ. The Templars, they concluded, had confessed to these acts and repented. Therefore, the Church could grant absolution. This was not a blanket exoneration of all charges. The commissioners did not address every accusation, and their mandate did not extend to the order's corporate fate. But in absolving the leaders personally from heresy, they created a record that contradicted the narrative Philip had worked to construct. The king needed the Templars condemned outright. The papacy had, at least in this instance, declared them redeemable. The Chinon hearings also revealed the complex psychology of the accused. Jacques de Molay admitted to the initiation ritual's offensive gestures, but insisted they were never intended as true blasphemy. He and the others spoke of the secrecy surrounding the rites, designed to test obedience and resilience, especially for those who might one day face capture by non-Christian enemies. They denied worshiping any idol and affirmed their adherence to the core tenets of the faith. The commissioners recorded these statements without any mention of torture, a notable departure from the earlier royal interrogations. Whether this reflected a genuine shift in method or merely a desire to present the papal inquiry as untainted by coercion is unclear. What is clear is that the Chinon process allowed for a more nuanced account than the stark admissions extracted in 1307. The location itself, Chinon, added layers to the event's significance. Perched on a ridge above the Vienne River, the chateau had long served as a royal stronghold. Now, under papal commission, it became the stage for a delicate assertion of ecclesiastical authority within the king's realm. The cardinals operated under Philip's watchful gaze, but their loyalty was to Clement. Every word they recorded was both a legal finding and a political signal. For Clement, the absolution was a way to reassert the Church's role as the ultimate judge in matters of faith. By declaring the Templar leaders not guilty of heresy, he retained the theological prerogative to decide their fate, rather than allowing Philip to proceed unchecked. Yet the absolution did not lead to release. The leaders remained imprisoned, their future tied to the broader political negotiations between Crown and Papacy. In the years immediately following, the Chinon parchment seems to have been little-sighted. The machinery of suppression moved forward, driven by the Council of Vienne, 1311-1312, and the transfer of Templar property to the Hospitallers. Publicly, the emphasis remained on the charges and confessions that supported dissolution. The absolution was an inconvenient counterpoint, quietly filed away in the Vatican's archive, where it would sleep for nearly 700 years. The Chinon episode is one of the most debated moments in the Templar saga. To some historians, it proves that the papacy recognized the order's innocence of heresy, even if other failings remained. To others, it shows only that the leaders were willing to conform to the Church's demands, and that absolution was a political tool rather than a theological judgment. Either way, it complicates the traditional view of the trials as a simple narrative of guilt confirmed by the Church. It also underscores the divergence between papal and royal objectives. Philip sought to dismantle the Templars entirely, absorbing their wealth and eliminating a rival power. Clement, though pressured to go along, seems to have preferred reform or reconstitution of the order under new leadership. The Chinon absolution can be read as evidence of this preference, a sign that he did not see the Templars as irredeemably corrupt. The rediscovery of the Chinon parchment in the 21st century reignited public interest in the Templars and fueled modern reassessments of their fate. Here was a primary source, long hidden, that recorded the Pope's representatives granting forgiveness for the most serious spiritual charge: heresy. In the world of medieval politics, this was not a minor detail. It was a statement of jurisdiction, a reminder that even kings could not unilaterally define orthodoxy. In the candlelit hall of the chateau, as each Templar leader received absolution, the immediate future must have seemed uncertain, but not hopeless. They could not have known that within a few years their order would be dissolved and their own lives cut short. Yet in that moment, with the cardinal's words of pardon echoing against stone walls, there was at least the possibility that the tide might turn. The Chinon absolution stands today as a fragile bridge between the confessions wrung out by chains and the final dissolution decreed by council. It is a reminder that even in an age of brutal power politics, the machinery of the Church could still produce verdicts at odds with secular ambition. And it is a reminder, too, that history often hides its most telling documents in the quietest corners, waiting for the right hands to lift them back into the light. From Chinon, the path would lead toward Vienne, where a council would gather to decide the Templars' fate once and for all. But the absolution granted in those castle chambers would leave an indelible, if faint, mark on the story, one that would resurface centuries later, challenging the accepted script and offering a glimpse of the complexities beneath the surface of medieval justice. By the opening of the 14th century's second decade, the fate of the Knights Templar had moved from the dim cells of interrogation to the grand stage of conciliar deliberation. The Council of Vienne, convened by Pope Clement V in October 1311, was the culmination of years of political maneuvering, legal proceedings, and whispered negotiations. It was here, in the small city of Vienne, on the Rhone's west bank, that the Church would decide the future of one of the most storied military orders in Christendom. The setting itself reflected the papacy's still unsettled geography. Vienne lay within the Holy Roman Empire, but close to French influence, a convenient midpoint for gathering bishops, abbots, and theologians from across Europe. Clement arrived with the weight of two competing pressures: Philip IV's relentless demand for dissolution and the lingering sense among some clerics that the Templars, though flawed, could be reformed rather than destroyed. Delegates came from as far afield as England, Spain, and the Italian states, their journeys long and often perilous. Each brought instructions from their monarchs or ecclesiastical superiors, and each carried his own perspective on the trials. Some had read the French confessions. Others had heard of the Chinon absolution. A few still clung to the belief that the order's martial mission could be salvaged for the defense of Christendom's remaining frontiers. The agenda of the council included many items, reforms to clerical life, crusading plans, and the perennial question of church taxation, but the Templar case dominated discussion. Officially, the Pope's position was that the order's guilt or innocence as a corporate body had not been definitively proven in canon law. Yet the political reality was far messier. Philip was present in Vienne, accompanied by his sons, his chancellor Guillaume de Nogaret, and a well-drilled delegation ready to press the crown's case. His very presence was a form of pressure. Few could forget what had happened to Boniface at Anagni. Over the winter of 1311-1312, debates unfolded in private sessions and public hearings. Witnesses were called, including some Templars, though their testimony was often colored by the conditions under which they had been held. The atmosphere was less that of an impartial court than of a gathering seeking a solution that would avoid open conflict between the most powerful monarch in Europe and the Papacy. The turning point came in March 1312. Clement, perhaps recognizing that a direct acquittal would be politically impossible, crafted a path that sidestepped a definitive verdict on the order's doctrinal guilt. On 22nd of March, in the bull Vox in Excelso, he declared the Templars suppressed, not by formal condemnation after trial, but by papal ordinance, by way of provision and ordinance of the Apostolic See. This careful phrasing meant the order was dissolved for the good of the Church, not explicitly convicted of heresy as a corporate body. By framing the dissolution this way, Clement avoided setting a precedent that a religious order could be destroyed solely on the king's charges. Yet the effect was the same. The Templars ceased to exist in the eyes of the Church. Their rule, name, and privileges were abolished, their assets to be transferred, at least in principle, to the Knights Hospitaller. The bull Ad Providam, issued in May 1312, detailed the transfer of Templar property. In theory, the Hospitallers would inherit lands, revenues, and rights to continue the mission of defending Christendom. In practice, the transition was uneven. In France, Philip's agents retained a substantial share of the wealth, citing the costs of the trials and the crown's expenses in maintaining the prisoners. In the Iberian kingdoms, local rulers often diverted assets to newly created orders more directly under their control, such as the Order of Montesa in Aragon and the Order of Christ in Portugal. For the Templars themselves, the council's decision sealed their fate. Many lower-ranking brothers were released, ordered to live out their lives in monastic houses or under strict penance. The leaders, Jacques de Molay, Geoffroy de Charnay, and others, remained in custody, their ultimate fate deferred but increasingly grim. The Council of Vienne also underscored the papacy's balancing act. Clement had preserved the formal dignity of papal jurisdiction by framing the suppression as an administrative act, but he had yielded to Philip's unyielding demand that the order be ended. The lesson for future popes was clear. In matters where the most powerful secular ruler was determined, even the papacy might have to compromise its ideal process for the sake of survival. Outside the council chambers, life in Vienne continued much as before. Merchants sold wine and cloth in the market square, barges moved along the Rhone, and pilgrims passed through on their way to shrines farther south. Yet for those within the Church's inner circles, the decision marked the end of an era. The Templars, who had once been the spear point of Christendom's defense in the Holy Land, were now a cautionary tale about wealth, secrecy, and the vulnerability of even the most formidable institutions. The council's records show that some delegates left dissatisfied. There were murmurs that the order had not been given a fair opportunity to defend itself before the full assembly. Others lamented the loss of a trained military force at a time when crusading to reclaim the Holy Land was still a declared goal. Yet the momentum of dissolution could not be reversed. With the bulls issued and sealed, the Church had spoken. In the months that followed, papal envoys traveled across Europe to enforce the suppression and oversee the transfer of property. In some regions, Templars went quietly into retirement. In others, they resisted or fled. A few vanished into the countryside, their fates unrecorded. These scattered remnants would later feed legends of a Templar diaspora, taking their secrets and treasures to hidden refuges. The Council of Vienne thus brought to a close the formal existence of the Templars, though the drama of their trials was not yet over. The executions of the order's leaders in Paris in 1314 would provide a final, fiery chapter. But in administrative terms, the papal decree at Vienne was the decisive act. The combination of royal pressure and papal sanction ensured that no appeal could reopen the case. Looking back, the council's decision can be read as both a capitulation and a calculated act of damage control. Clement had preserved, at least on paper, the principle that only the Pope could suppress a religious order, but he had also demonstrated that principle's limits, when confronted by the concentrated political and military power of a monarch like Philip IV. The Rhone, flowing past Vienne, carried away the news toward Avignon, toward Rome, and across the ports of the Mediterranean. In its currents mingled the end of an order and the continuation of a papal strategy that prized institutional survival over confrontation. For the Templars, the current carried them toward dissolution, dispersal, and the realm of legend. For the Papacy, it carried a quieter but equally enduring lesson, that the keys of Peter must sometimes turn in locks chosen by others. By the mid-14th century, the papal court at Avignon had transformed from Clement V's cautious refuge into a fixture of European political life. Its towers and halls bustled with clerics, diplomats, and merchants. Its treasury brimmed with revenues from annates, tithes, and fees that flowed in from across Christendom. Yet for all its administrative efficiency, Avignon carried a stigma that no wall could keep out, a reputation as a papal exile, and worse, a moral exile. The most enduring condemnation came from the poet and humanist Francesco Petrarch, whose pen could cut as sharply as any sword. Living for a time in nearby Vaucluse, Petrarch knew Avignon well enough to observe its courtly rituals, its luxuries, and its intrigues. In letters and poems, he began to call the city the Babylon of the West, invoking the biblical exile of the Israelites in Babylon as a metaphor for the papacy's absence from Rome. To Petrarch, Avignon was a place where the air was thick with greed, where the spiritual mission of the church was obscured by the accumulation of wealth and the pursuit of influence. He painted it as a place of ostentation, where cardinals lived in palatial residences, dined lavishly, and engaged in political gamesmanship. His words resonated with Italians already resentful of the papacy's distance from Rome, and with reform-minded clergy who feared the loss of pastoral connection. The Babylonian captivity metaphor, once coined, took on a life of its own. It captured not just the idea of physical dislocation, but the sense that the papacy had become captive to French influence. The fact that the popes of Avignon were almost uniformly French by birth did little to dispel this perception. Their close ties to the French crown, whether in reality or in appearance, made it easy for critics to believe that the successor of Peter was no longer an independent arbiter of Christendom, but a courtier in a king's orbit. Yet within Avignon itself, the papal administration was anything but idle. The Palais des Papes expanded under successive popes, Benedict XV's austere fortress wings, Clement VI's grand and lavish additions, Innocent VI's functional improvements. The papal library grew into one of the finest in Europe, its manuscripts catalogued and copied with precision. The papal court issued thousands of documents each year, settling disputes, appointing bishops, granting dispensations, and managing the Church's far-flung affairs. From a purely logistical standpoint, Avignon offered advantages that Rome in the 14th century could not match. The city was politically stable, surrounded by relatively secure territory, and positioned along the Rhone for easy trade and communication. The papal court could receive envoys from England, the Empire, and the Iberian kingdoms without the hazards of Italian factional warfare. The revenues collected in Avignon could be administered without the constant threat of siege or interruption. But perception is often more potent than fact in matters of legitimacy. Rome's defenders pointed to the apostolic tradition. Peter and Paul had died there. The early popes had ruled from there. And the city's basilicas were the living heart of Christian history. To remove the papal seat from Rome was to sever a living root, even if the transplant thrived materially in new soil. The rhetoric of exile intensified in times of crisis. When plague struck Avignon in 1348, killing thousands, including large portions of the curial staff, some saw it as divine judgment on a papacy that had turned its back on the eternal city. Others argued that the concentration of wealth and people in Avignon made such devastation inevitable, regardless of divine will. Criticism was not limited to poets and preachers. Political thinkers in universities and royal courts questioned whether the papacy's credibility as a universal institution could survive its long absence from Rome. Diplomats from Italy sometimes treated Avignon with open disdain, attending only when political necessity forced them. Even within the Curia, there were voices that quietly favored a return, though such opinions rarely reached the public. Still, Avignon had its defenders. They pointed to the administrative reforms, the increased efficiency of papal finance, and the relative peace that allowed the Church to function without the constant disruptions of Roman politics. They noted that the papacy's moral authority was grounded in its spiritual mission, not in the streets or stones of any one city. The argument was logical, but it rarely stirred hearts the way Petrarch's imagery did. The city itself bore the marks of its paradoxical status. Its skyline was dominated by the palace, yet beyond the walls lay vineyards, farms, and villages little changed by the papal presence. Merchants grew wealthy selling goods to the court. Artisans thrived on commissions for tapestries, furnishings, and manuscripts. Pilgrims still came, though fewer than to Rome, drawn by the hope of papal blessings or favors. Outside Avignon, the Babylon label became a rallying cry for those who saw reform as inseparable from return. It was repeated in sermons, copied into chronicles, and used by later generations as a shorthand for the perceived worldliness of the Avignon popes. Even after the papacy returned to Rome, the term endured, shaping the historical memory of the entire period. Ironically, while Petrarch's critique was scathing, he also maintained friendships with some members of the Curia. His letters reveal a man torn between personal affection for individuals and contempt for the institution's perceived captivity. This ambivalence mirrored the larger European attitude toward Avignon: respect for its competence, frustration at its location. By the mid-century, the papacy's position in Avignon seemed secure. Multiple generations had known no other seat, and the palace had become a symbol of continuity. Yet beneath the surface, the pressure of perception was building. Reformers like Catherine of Siena would later draw on the Babylonian image to urge the Pope to return to Rome, linking geography with spiritual renewal. The Rhone, indifferent to metaphor, flowed past the city's walls as it always had, carrying barges of wine, wool, and manuscripts. But in the words of poets and preachers, it became a river of exile, its waters separating the papacy from the Tiber, from Rome, from the tombs of the apostles. The reality of Avignon's administrative success could not fully counter the power of that image. In time, this tension between stability and tradition, between practical governance and symbolic legitimacy, would push the papacy toward a decision. For now, though, the towers of Avignon stood firm, its archives filled with neatly written bulls and briefs, while outside, the nickname Babylon clung like ivy to its walls. The stage was set for the next trials: plague, persuasion, and the slow current of return. In the spring of 1348, the calm rhythm of Avignon's papal court was broken by whispers of a sickness moving westward. News arrived first as rumor: ships in the Mediterranean harbors of Genoa and Marseille carrying death in their holds, strange swellings on the body, sudden fevers, and a stench that clung to the air. Within weeks, it was no longer rumor. The Black Death had reached the Rhone, and Avignon, seat of the papacy, was about to become one of its most concentrated crucibles. The city, enclosed by its walls and crowded with clerics, merchants, servants, and visitors, was an ideal breeding ground for disease. By the time the first visible cases appeared, the infection had already spread invisibly through markets, taverns, and the narrow lanes between the Palais des Papes and the cathedral. Witnesses later described how the air seemed heavier, how the bustling streets grew strangely quiet, and how the bells tolled more often, first for individuals, then for whole households. Pope Clement VI, a man of political skill and cultivated tastes, found himself confronting a crisis beyond diplomacy or fiscal management. The sheer scale of mortality defied the Church's traditional tools of prayer, penance, and processions. Yet Clement acted decisively in ways that were both practical and symbolic. One of the most famous accounts tells of the Pope secluding himself between two constantly burning fires in a chamber of the palace, believing the heat would purify the air and ward off infection. Whether the method had any effect is doubtful, but the image of the pontiff surrounded by flames became part of the city's folklore. Clement also took a step unprecedented in its scope. He granted plenary indulgences to all who died of the plague, absolving them of sin without the usual confession and penance, provided they died in a state of contrition. The logistical impossibility of providing last rites to thousands of victims made this decree both compassionate and necessary. In doing so, the Pope extended the Church's care into a realm where human presence could no longer reliably reach. Avignon cemeteries quickly overflowed. Chroniclers wrote of mass graves dug outside the city walls, filled layer upon layer as the death toll mounted. In some areas, the soil was said to move with the gases of decomposition. To address the shortage of burial space, contemporary reports claimed Clement even consecrated the Rhone, allowing bodies to be cast into its waters with the assurance that they rested in sanctified ground. The sight of weighted corpses slipping into the current must have left a grim impression on those who stood along the banks. The city's economy collapsed almost overnight. Merchants closed their shops, either dead or fled. Barges ceased to unload goods. Artisans abandoned their workshops. In the palace, the papal bureaucracy shrank as scribes, notaries, and servants succumbed. Documents from 1348 and 1349 show noticeable gaps, as if the pen itself had been stilled by the pestilence. Cardinals and bishops died alongside servants and beggars, erasing distinctions that usually structured daily life in the city. Outside Avignon, rural areas were hit just as hard. Villages lost entire populations, leaving fields untilled and livestock untended. Refugees sometimes sought entry to the city, hoping the Pope's presence might mean protection, but the gates were often closed to prevent further contagion. Inside, the fear of strangers became a reflex, and people avoided even their neighbors. The plague also exposed the darker side of human reaction to disaster. In some parts of Europe, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the disease. Although Avignon's Jewish population was under papal protection, and Clement issued bulls condemning such accusations, fear and violence still threatened them. The Pope's formal defense, stating that Jews were dying of the plague as readily as Christians, did not always prevent attacks elsewhere. Spiritually, the Black Death challenged the Church's ability to explain and console. Was this God's punishment for sin? A test of faith? A mystery beyond human grasp? Preachers in Avignon and beyond offered varying answers, some urging repentance and reform, others warning against despair. The Pope's indulgence decree provided a kind of theological anchor, assuring the faithful that death in the plague was not a sign of damnation, yet the experience left scars. Survivors often carried a sense of divine abandonment, or conversely, a feeling of special deliverance that could shade into fatalism. Clergy who had remained at their posts, hearing confessions, administering last rites where possible, were celebrated as heroes. Others who fled were criticized, sometimes harshly, in local records. In the years after 1348, Avignon slowly repopulated, though it never quite regained the same density. The plague returned in later waves, each less deadly, but still feared. The memory of the first onslaught, however, lingered. Stories of the fires in the papal chamber, the river burials, and the empty streets became part of the city's collective identity. The Rhone itself, consecrated by papal decree, took on a new symbolic role. It was no longer just a lifeline for trade and communication. It was a vast flowing graveyard, a witness to the indiscriminate nature of the disease. Pilgrims who came to Avignon in later decades might hear tales of how the waters had borne away thousands, sanctified yet unmarked, into the sea. For the Papacy, the plague years reinforced the value of Avignon's stability. Rome, with its volatile politics, might not have been better able to withstand such a crisis. But the association of the Papacy with this city of death also deepened the Babylonian stigma. Critics could now point not only to Avignon's wealth and worldliness, but to its role as the epicenter of one of Europe's greatest catastrophes. Pope Clement VI himself survived the plague, continuing his patronage of the arts and administration of the Church. but his reign would forever be linked to the Black Death, his image fixed in memory as the pontiff who ruled from behind walls of stone and fire, while the streets outside emptied into silence. When the pestilence finally ebbed, Avignon emerged changed, its population reduced, its markets diminished, its palace quieter. Yet its political machinery endured. The Curia resumed its functions, sending and receiving envoys, managing revenues, and issuing bulls as before. Life returned, but with an awareness that the stability of stone could not fully shield against the frailty of flesh. And so the papal court carried on, its archives recording both the spiritual and administrative responses to the disaster. The Rhone resumed its role as a river of commerce, but for those who had seen its dark burden in 1348, it would forever hold another current, invisible but remembered. A current of loss flowing beneath the surface of Avignon's long night. And as the smoke thinned, a young Sienese began to write letters that would call the papacy home. By the 1370s, the papacy had been in Avignon for nearly 7 decades. For an entire generation, the idea of the Pope residing anywhere else was a matter of history, not memory. Yet outside the Rhone's walls, calls for a return to Rome had never fully ceased. Among the most persistent, and certainly the most passionate voices, was that of a woman who had never held office, never worn the robes of a cleric, and yet wielded an influence few courtiers could match: Catherine of Siena. Born in 1347, the year before the Black Death reached Avignon, Catherine grew up in Siena in the midst of a fractured Italy. She joined the Dominican lay order in her teens, devoting herself to prayer, fasting, and acts of charity. Her personal holiness and her visions. She reported mystical experiences in which she conversed directly with Christ, quickly drew attention, not only from the faithful, but also from political leaders. By her early 30s, she was writing to kings, queens, and bishops with a boldness that startled her contemporaries. Catherine's letters to Pope Gregory VI, the last of the Avignon popes, form one of the most striking correspondences of the medieval church. Written in the Tuscan vernacular rather than the formal Latin of official documents, they speak directly, often urgently, to the man she called Sweet Christ on earth. Her tone blends reverence with frank admonition, urging Gregory to return the papal court to Rome as a matter of both divine will and political necessity. In one letter, she told him plainly that he was in the place of the glorious shepherd Christ, yet warned that he must act decisively to heal the Church's divisions. Remaining in Avignon, she argued, was a sign of weakness, a concession to fear and faction. The true seat of Peter was in Rome, and only by returning there could the papacy reclaim its full moral authority. Catherine's appeals were not limited to geography. She also pressed Gregory to pursue reform within the Church, to root out corruption, and to appoint worthy pastors to dioceses. Her vision was of a revitalized church, both spiritually pure and visibly united, with the Pope at its head in the city where Peter had been martyred. She was not naive about the dangers awaiting him in Italy: factional violence, political intrigue, and the ever-shifting loyalties of the Roman populace, but she believed those hazards were preferable to the spiritual malaise she saw in Avignon's permanence. Gregory XII's position was more complex than Catherine's letters sometimes acknowledged. Avignon was secure, its palace formidable, its administration efficient. Rome, by contrast, was politically unstable. Its noble families, the Orsini, Colonna, and others, constantly vying for control. Yet Gregory was not deaf to the symbolic power of a return. He had heard the criticisms from Italian envoys, the laments of Roman clergy, and the pointed rhetoric of poets still invoking the Babylonian captivity. Catherine's words reached him in part because they came not from a court faction or a political interest, but from a laywoman whose authority rested on spiritual charisma. She traveled to Avignon in 1376, meeting the Pope in person. Chroniclers record that she spoke to him directly, reinforcing her written appeals with the urgency of face-to-face counsel. Her presence in the papal court, a woman from Siena, unadorned and unschooled in diplomatic etiquette, was itself a reminder that moral authority did not depend on the trappings of power. Her mission coincided with broader political pressures. The ongoing conflict between France and England, the 100 Years' War, strained the papacy's neutrality. The War of the Eight Saints, 1375-1378, pitting Florence against the papacy, further highlighted the limitations of ruling from Avignon when much of Italy was in rebellion or on the brink. Gregory faced a growing realization that his court's physical absence from Rome undermined its claim to arbitrate Italian affairs. Catherine framed the decision in spiritual terms. Remaining in Avignon, she warned, risked divine judgment. Returning to Rome would be an act of faith, a sign of trust in God's providence. Her letters often combined tender exhortations with sharp rebukes, urging Gregory to be manly and not to fear the storms of opposition. In her theology, the Pope's courage was not a personal virtue alone, but a reflection of the Church's courage as a whole. The rhetorical power of Catherine's letters lay in their blending of the mystical and the practical. She could speak of Christ as a bridegroom calling the Pope home, and in the next breath discuss the political advantages of re-establishing the papal presence in Rome. This fusion allowed her to bridge the gap between religious devotion and realpolitik in a way that few others could. Her appeals did not work in isolation. Other voices, Italian cardinals, Roman ambassadors, reformist clergy, were also pressing for a return. But Catherine's role as a lay mystic made her involvement unusual and memorable. She became, in effect, the conscience of the movement, reminding Gregory that his decisions had eternal as well as temporal consequences. When Gregory X finally decided to leave Avignon in 1376, sailing for Rome in early 1377, Catherine's influence was widely acknowledged, though historians debate how decisive it truly was. She herself saw the return as a divine victory, the fulfillment of her mission. Yet she also recognized that the move would not, by itself, resolve the Church's deeper divisions. The years ahead would see new crises, including the Western Schism, in which rival popes once again divided Christendom. The surviving letters remain a testament to Catherine's force of will and clarity of vision. They are also a rare window into a moment when the course of papal history was shaped, in part, by the voice of a laywoman. In a world where formal authority was almost exclusively male and clerical, Catherine of Siena's pen carried a weight that reached the highest throne in the Church. In the streets of Avignon, her presence was fleeting, a visitor whose sandals left no lasting mark on the stones. But in the currents of the Rhone, her words traveled far, mingling with the tide of political calculation, spiritual longing, and the enduring question of where the heart of the papacy should beat. The bridge she urged Gregory to cross was both literal and symbolic, spanning not just the distance between Avignon and Rome, but between security and witness, between administrative stability and apostolic tradition. When she returned to Italy, Catherine continued to write, continued to exhort, and continued to believe that her role was to speak truth to the shepherd of the Church. The fact that her letters are still read today, centuries later, is a reminder that sometimes the most enduring acts of influence are carried not by armies or decrees, but by ink on paper, sealed with conviction rather than wax. By the mid-1370s, Pope Gregory V was a man standing between two worlds. On one side was Avignon, with its stone ramparts, secure palace, and well-oiled administrative machinery. On the other was Rome, turbulent and fractious, but steeped in apostolic memory. For nearly 70 years, the Rhone had been the papal river. Gregory now began to hear, faint but insistent, the call of the Tiber. Gregory, born Pierre Roger de Beaufort in Limousin, was a nephew of Pope Clement VI and had grown up in the atmosphere of the Avignon court. Elevated to the cardinalate while still young, he was steeped in its rhythms, the measured pace of bureaucracy, the close relationship with the French crown, the cautious diplomacy of a court designed for stability over spectacle. Yet from the day of his election in 1370, the question of Rome was never far from his mind, pressed upon him by Italian envoys, reformist clergy, and voices like that of Catherine of Siena. The currents pushing Gregory toward Rome were more than spiritual persuasion. Politically, the papacy's prolonged absence had weakened its hold over the papal states, those scattered territories in central Italy that were theoretically under papal rule, but in practice governed by local lords or mercenaries. In Rome itself, noble families like the Orsini and Colonna filled the power vacuum, often clashing violently and sometimes appealing to outside powers for support. The city's infrastructure had decayed, its population diminished, and its symbolic weight was in danger of slipping into the realm of nostalgia rather than living authority. Compounding the problem was the War of the Eight Saints, 1375-1378, a conflict between the papacy and a coalition of Italian city-states led by Florence. This war underscored the difficulty of ruling Italy from the safety of Avignon. Papal forces fought in the Romagna and Tuscany, but the distance between the front lines and the Rhone dulled the papacy's responsiveness and credibility. To negotiate peace, Gregory needed to project strength, and strength in the eyes of many Italians meant presence. The decision to leave Avignon could not be taken lightly. The city was secure, and its palace represented decades of investment in both architecture and administration. Avignon's location in the Comtat Venezian also offered a valuable buffer between the Pope and the violent instability of the Italian peninsula. Moving to Rome would mean not only physical danger, but also the risk of losing the tight fiscal control developed in Avignon. Yet the symbolic stakes were too high to ignore. A pope in Rome would silence, at least for a time, the charges of Babylonian captivity and restore the connection to the city of Peter and Paul. For Gregory, who saw himself as the custodian of both the Church's spiritual mission and its earthly dignity, this argument was persuasive. In 1376, Catherine of Siena's personal visit added moral urgency to the debate. She spoke with Gregory in Avignon, urging him to trust in divine providence and to embrace the courage befitting the shepherd of the Church. Her letters, written before and after their meeting, framed the return not as a political maneuver, but as an act of obedience to God's will. While historians debate the precise weight of her influence, her words found fertile ground in a mind already balancing on the decision. There were other pressures. The French crown, while a traditional ally of the Avignon popes, was embroiled in the Hundred Years' War and could not offer the same level of protective oversight as in earlier decades. This weakening of the French connection made a return to Rome less politically hazardous than it might have been in Clement V's or Benedict XIV's time. The final deliberations were as much logistical as they were ideological. Moving the papal court meant transporting not only the pope and cardinals, but also the vast administrative apparatus, chancellery clerks, financial officers, archives, ceremonial treasures, and the papal library. Ships would have to be secured for the Mediterranean voyage, with armed escorts to guard against pirates and hostile fleets. Provisions and accommodations had to be arranged for the overland segments of the journey. Gregory's decision was announced with measured solemnity. The rationale blended the spiritual and the practical, to restore the Church's unity, to strengthen its presence in the Papal States, and to honor the tradition of the Roman See. Preparations began in late 1376, and by the turn of the year, the papal flotilla was ready to depart. The departure from Avignon was both ceremonial and poignant. Chroniclers record that the people of the city lined the streets, some blessing the Pope, others lamenting the loss of the court's economic vitality. Merchants, innkeepers, and artisans had grown prosperous from the papal presence. Their livelihoods would now diminish, yet there was also a sense of historical closure, as if the long arc of the Avignon papacy was bending toward its inevitable end. Gregory traveled down the Rhone by boat, a symbolic reversal of the journey made by Clement V nearly 70 years earlier. Winter winds cut across the water, and the hills rose dark on either side. At Marseille, the papal party boarded ships for the voyage along the Mediterranean coast, past the Ligurian and Tuscan shores, and finally to the mouth of the Tiber. The journey was not without risk. Storms and hostile vessels remained threats, but it was completed without disaster. On January 17, 1377, Gregory X entered Rome. The city greeted him with a mixture of jubilation and skepticism. Bells rang from the basilicas, and processions wound through streets still scarred by neglect. The Pope took up residence in the Lateran Palace, the traditional seat of the papacy before the construction of the Vatican's modern complex. Yet he was immediately confronted by the realities Catherine and others had warned of: factional rivalries, crumbling infrastructure, and the tenuous loyalty of the city's populace. Gregory's return did not instantly restore the Church's unity or prestige. The administrative systems of Avignon had to be adapted to Rome's more volatile environment. The Pope's efforts to assert authority in the Papal States met with resistance, and tensions in Italy remained high. Still, the symbolic impact of his move was undeniable. For the first time in nearly 7 decades, the Pope was again in the city that bore the weight of apostolic tradition. Tragically, Gregory's time in Rome was short. He died in late March 1378, little more than a year after his arrival. His death would open the door to the Western Schism, as rival claimants to the papacy emerged in both Rome and Avignon. Yet his decision to return remained a turning point, both in the history of the Avignon papacy and in the broader narrative of the medieval Church. The Rhone had carried the papacy to Avignon, and decades later carried it away again. In Gregory's wake, the city would retain its walls, its palace, and its memories, but no longer the steady beat of the papal court. The Tiber, after long absence, once again reflected the white-robed figure of the Bishop of Rome. Whether the return fulfilled the hopes of reformers like Catherine or merely set the stage for new divisions is a question history continues to weigh. On the cold morning of January 17, 1377, the bells of Rome rang in unison, their tones scattering over the 7 hills and across the Tiber's winter waters. For the first time in nearly 70 years, the Bishop of Rome had returned to his ancient seat. Pope Gregory XII's procession into the city was both an act of triumph and a test of endurance, one that revealed as much about the fragility of papal authority as it did about its resilience. The journey from Avignon had been long and carefully choreographed. Gregory's flotilla had departed Marseille weeks earlier, sailing along the coasts of Provence and Liguria, stopping briefly at Genoa and Pisa before approaching the mouth of the Tiber. The voyage itself was a statement, the Pope returning not under duress, but in a deliberate and ceremonial manner, accompanied by cardinals, clerics, and the physical symbols of his office, the papal tiara, the seals of the chancery, and the relics venerated by the court. As the procession moved through the city's gates, it was met with mixed emotion. Crowds gathered to greet the pontiff, waving palm branches and singing hymns, but not all faces showed unqualified joy. Rome had changed in the papacy's absence. The population had dwindled. Many of its grand buildings had fallen into disrepair. Noble families, the Orsini, Colonna, Savelli, held sway over districts, their rivalries occasionally erupting into violence. Some welcomed the return as a chance for renewal. Others feared it would upset the delicate balance of power they had grown used to. Gregory took up residence in the Lateran Palace, the traditional home of the popes, before the Vatican complex became their primary seat. But the Lateran was a shadow of its former glory. Fires in earlier decades had damaged parts of the structure, and repairs had been sporadic at best. Gregory's court, accustomed to the polished stability of the Palais des Papes in Avignon, now found itself in a capital whose grandeur was mingled with grit, where the weight of history pressed as heavily as the demands of the present. From the outset, Gregory sought to reassert papal authority in the city and the papal states. He worked to restore order to the streets, negotiating with the Roman barons and attempting to bring the fractious countryside under tighter control. His efforts were hampered by the same realities that had driven earlier popes toward Avignon, the volatility of Italian politics and the limits of papal military strength. Still, the symbolic value of his presence was immense. Diplomats from across Europe now came to Rome for papal audiences, walking streets where, in their minds, the aura of Peter and Paul was more tangible than in Avignon's carefully built palaces. The return also allowed Gregory to preside personally over key religious ceremonies in the city's great basilicas, St. Peter's, St. John Lateran, and Santa Maria Maggiore, strengthening the visual and spiritual association between the papacy and its ancient home. Yet beneath the pageantry, tensions simmered. The memory of the Babylonian captivity was fresh enough that many Romans viewed Gregory's move as an overdue correction rather than a bold new beginning. Others, particularly among the city's elite, feared the centralization of power that his presence might bring. The delicate negotiations between the Pope and the municipal government reflected this balance of hope and mistrust. Nor was the return universally celebrated beyond Rome. In France, Pomain In effrayant to restate, the papacy's departure from Avignon was seen by some as a loss of influence. French cardinals, who had enjoyed proximity to their homeland during the Avignon years, now faced the long and sometimes dangerous journey to Rome. The French crown, though preoccupied with the Hundred Years' War, still valued the closeness of the Avignon arrangement and regarded the relocation with a mixture of resignation and resentment. Gregory himself was under no illusion that the move would solve the Church's deeper problems. The War of the Eight Saints had left scars in Italy, and tensions with Florence remained unresolved despite peace negotiations. The administrative systems refined in Avignon needed to be transplanted to Rome without losing their efficiency, a task complicated by the city's less predictable infrastructure and security. The return also brought logistical challenges on a scale rarely seen in medieval governance. The papal archives, a treasure trove of bulls, decrees, and correspondence, had to be safeguarded and re-established in the Lateran. The papal mint, treasury, and chancellery required new quarters. Courtiers needed lodging, supplies, and protection in a city not yet accustomed to the rhythms of the Curia after so long an absence. Gregory's physical presence in Rome was a statement that the Pope belonged in the city of the Apostles, but it was also a gamble. His health was not strong, and the strains of the journey and the work of re-establishing papal authority took their toll. In the months following his arrival, he focused on consolidating the papacy's position in the Papal States, sending legates and military commanders to assert control in regions where local rulers had grown accustomed to autonomy. Symbolically, the return was marked by public liturgies that emphasized the continuity of the papal office despite the years in Avignon. Gregory celebrated Mass at St. Peter's, processing beneath its ancient columns and offering blessings to the faithful gathered in the square. He also visited the tombs of Peter and Paul, a gesture that carried immense spiritual weight and reinforced the connection between the papacy and the city that bore their witness. But the triumph was short-lived. Gregory's tenure in Rome lasted little more than a year. His death in March 1378 left the Church in a precarious position. The papal seat was once again in Rome, but the stability of that arrangement was far from assured. The conclave that followed his death would be one of the most contentious in history, producing a chain of events that led to the Western Schism, a fracture in which rival popes claimed the throne from both Rome and Avignon. For the people of Rome, the return of 1377 was both a restoration and a beginning of new uncertainties. The sight of the Pope riding through their streets stirred pride in the city's unique role, but it also foreshadowed the struggles ahead as Rome became the focal point of competing allegiances. In Avignon, the papal palace remained standing, its rooms emptied of the daily bustle of the Curia, but still holding the echoes of nearly 7 decades of governance. Merchants who had prospered during the papal era adjusted to quieter markets, and the city settled into the role of a former capital, a place of memory rather than of present power. Gregory's return to Rome was, in the end, a hinge moment in papal history, the closing of the Avignon chapter and the prelude to the schism. The Rhone and the Tiber, 2 rivers that had each carried the papacy, now symbolized the twin poles of loyalty that would soon divide Christendom. For one brief year, the chair of Peter stood undisputed in its ancient home, and the bells of January 1377 echoed as a promise, one that events would soon put to the test. When Gregory the Feast died in late March 1378, Rome was still in the delicate first year of hosting the papal court again. His death brought the immediate and urgent question of succession, and with it, the political tinderbox that had been smoldering since the return from Avignon. The conclave that gathered to elect the new pope was composed largely of French cardinals, many of whom had spent decades in Avignon. Their loyalties, expectations, and sense of papal governance were shaped by that environment. Rome, however, was now the stage, and the Roman populace was determined that the papacy remain in its ancient seat. The city was tense. News of Gregory's death spread quickly, and Roman civic leaders feared that a non-Italian pope might mean another removal of the Curia to Avignon. Crowds gathered outside the conclave, shouting demands that the next pontiff be a Roman, or at least an Italian. Chroniclers record that the mood was not merely festive or hopeful, it was charged, even threatening. The cardinals understood that their decision would be scrutinized not only by their peers and sovereigns, but by the people massed beyond the conclave's walls. On April 8, 1378, the cardinals elected Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. Though not a Roman, Prignano was Italian, and his reputation as a capable administrator and reform-minded churchman seemed to suit the moment. His election satisfied, for the time being, the public demand for an Italian pope, and avoided an immediate crisis with the Roman civic authorities. Urban VI began his pontificate with an agenda that aligned, at least outwardly, with the reformist spirit many had hoped for. He spoke openly about curbing the luxuries of the cardinals, reducing the costs of the papal court, and addressing clerical absenteeism. At first, these goals met with cautious approval, but Urban's temperament, unyielding, quick to anger, and often scathing in his criticism, soon alienated the very cardinals whose support he needed. Within weeks, tensions erupted. Urban's temper, as cutting as his reforms, turned admonition into affront, and affront into open revolt. Urban chastised the cardinals in public, accusing them of greed, laxity, and neglect of their pastoral duties. He also disregarded some of the Curia's established procedures, making unilateral decisions without the customary consultation. While reform in principle could be defended, Urban's manner of pursuing it, abrupt, personal, and often humiliating to his colleagues, turned reform into a weapon that deepened divisions. The French cardinals, in particular, bristled at his treatment. Many of them had enjoyed significant influence during the Avignon years, and viewed Urban's brusque style as an affront to their dignity. They also suspected that his hostility toward them was rooted not just in reformist zeal, but in a deliberate effort to consolidate power by undermining their authority. The conflict escalated in the summer of 1378. A number of cardinals began to claim that Urban's election had been invalid, arguing that it had been conducted under duress from the Roman populace. They contended that the threat of violence from the crowds outside the conclave had forced them to choose an Italian candidate, making the result canonically questionable. This claim was controversial even at the time. While there had been clear public pressure, the formal procedures of election had been followed. Nevertheless, the argument provided a pretext for action. In August, several French cardinals left Rome for Anagni, a papal residence outside the city, where they began to organize opposition to Urban. From there, they issued formal declarations challenging his legitimacy and calling for a new election. Urban, in turn, excommunicated them, setting the stage for a schism that would fracture the unity of the Church. The defection of the cardinals from Urban Essex was not purely ideological. It reflected deeper geopolitical divisions between the French and Italian spheres of influence. France, still engaged in the Hundred Years' War with England, valued a papacy close to its territory and sympathetic to its interests. Italy, fragmented but fiercely protective of the papacy's Roman heritage, resisted any return to Avignon. Urban's election and his uncompromising demeanor had sharpened these existing tensions into open hostility. By September 1378, the dissenting cardinals had moved from Anagni to Fondi, a fortified town under the protection of Queen Joanna I of Naples, a political ally to the French faction. There, in a rival conclave, they elected Robert of Geneva as pope. Robert took the name Clement VII and soon made his way to Avignon, re-establishing the papal court in the very palace Gregory V had left behind only the year before. Two keys, struck on separate rings. The election of Clement VII marked the formal beginning of the Western Schism. Christendom now had two popes, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of Peter, each excommunicating the other. Nations and principalities aligned themselves according to political and cultural loyalties. France, Scotland, and much of Spain recognized Clement in Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stood with Urban in Rome. Urban VI, for his part, entrenched himself in Rome, continuing his reformist measures but also becoming increasingly isolated. His suspicion of the cardinals deepened, and he appointed new members to the college, mostly Italians, further polarizing the church's leadership. His pontificate would be marked by both administrative efforts to maintain the Roman See and military campaigns to secure the Papal States against forces loyal to Avignon. The rupture that began in 1378 was not merely a clerical quarrel. It divided monasteries, parishes, and entire kingdoms. Ordinary Christians, who might never see a pope in their lifetime, now faced the bewildering question of which pope to follow, which papal decrees to obey, and whose absolutions were valid. The theological implications were profound. If the pope was the supreme earthly authority of the church, what happened when two men claimed the title? For Rome, the first year of Urban's reign was a volatile mixture of hope and disillusionment. The city that had rejoiced at Gregory X's return now watched as the papacy's unity unraveled before their eyes. For Avignon, the arrival of Clement VII was a bittersweet revival of its papal glory, shadowed by the knowledge that it now stood in open rivalry with Rome. In the Rhone Valley, the great palace once again hummed with the business of papal governance, but the aura of unchallenged authority was gone. Along the Tiber, Urban VI worked to fortify both his position and the walls around him, knowing that the schism would not be settled quickly. The conclave of 1378 had been intended to secure the future of the papacy in Rome. Instead, it opened a wound that would bleed through the next 4 decades, reshaping the politics, theology, and diplomacy of late medieval Europe. And in both Rome and Avignon, the cardinals who had once sat together in council now prayed in different chapels for different pontiffs under the same God. The year 1378 marked a fracture unprecedented in the history of the medieval church. What had begun as a contested papal election in Rome hardened into a reality that seemed unthinkable. 2 popes, each claiming the authority of Peter, each commanding a court, a college of cardinals, and a network of loyal clergy. The Western Schism was not merely a matter of ecclesiastical governance. It was a crisis that shook the spiritual and political foundations of Christendom. On one throne sat Urban VI in Rome, the Italian reformer whose sharp tongue and uncompromising manner had alienated many of his original supporters, but secured the loyalty of much of Italy, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. On the other, in Avignon, sat Clement VII, the French-born Robert of Geneva, a man of noble lineage and considerable diplomatic skill, whose election by the dissenting cardinals was justified on the grounds of the alleged coercion during Urban's election. Clement re-established his court in the familiar halls of the Palais des Papes, restoring a rhythm Avignon had known for nearly 7 decades. The division of allegiance followed patterns of political rivalry as much as religious conviction. France and Scotland, bound in the Auld Alliance, stood firmly behind Clement. Castile and Aragon in the Iberian Peninsula followed suit, as did parts of the Papal States loyal to French influence. Urban, meanwhile, found allies in England, whose war with France made support for the Roman Pope a matter of national interest, and in the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, where suspicion of French dominance was long-standing. This geographical split was reinforced by papal diplomacy. Both Urban and Clement sent envoys across Europe, seeking recognition from monarchs, bishops, and university faculties. Acceptance of one pope often meant not only the rejection of the other's spiritual authority, but also the alignment of secular alliances. To support Clement was to tilt toward French interests. To back Urban was to resist them. For the faithful, the schism introduced confusion into the most basic acts of devotion. If one confessed sins to a priest loyal to Avignon, were those sins absolved in the eyes of God if Rome claimed that priests' faculties were invalid? If one received indulgences from Urban's chancery, did they carry any weight if Clement's court denounced them as fraudulent? These questions troubled theologians and ordinary believers alike, eroding the certainty that had long underpinned the papacy's moral authority. The theological problem was compounded by the fact that both popes governed in much the same manner as their predecessors. Each maintained a college of cardinals, issued bulls, appointed bishops, and presided over the ceremonial life of their respective courts. To the casual observer, each appeared to be a legitimate pope, complete with regalia, processions, and the rhetoric of divine right. The schism was not a case of an obvious pretender versus an undisputed pontiff. It was a contest between two claimants who both occupied the visible forms of the papal office. The financial implications were equally severe. Each papal court required revenue to maintain its clergy, ambassadors, and military defenses. Taxes and tithes that once flowed into a single treasury were now split, with local rulers sometimes using the schism as an opportunity to withhold funds or redirect them to their own purposes. The competition for resources drove both Urban and Clement to seek support more aggressively, granting favors, offices, and benefices to loyalists. This, in turn, deepened the entanglement of the papacy in secular politics. Military conflict was never far from the surface. In Italy, Urban VI faced resistance from forces loyal to Avignon, especially in the Kingdom of Naples, where Queen Joanna III recognized Clement. Urban responded by supporting her rival, Charles of Durazzo, sparking a series of campaigns that intertwined dynastic ambition with the ecclesiastical dispute. Clement, for his part, secured the backing of French troops to defend his position in Avignon and to project influence into contested regions. Universities became battlegrounds of a different kind. Theologians in Paris, Oxford, and Prague debated the legitimacy of each pope, producing treatises that sought to untangle the legal and canonical complexities of the elections. Some scholars argued that only a general council of the Church could resolve the dispute, reviving an idea that had been dormant since the early centuries of Christianity. This conciliarist approach would gain momentum in the decades ahead, but in the late 14th century, it remained more an academic proposal than a practical solution. In the daily life of the faithful, the schism was felt in subtle but pervasive ways. Monasteries sometimes split their allegiances, with one abbot recognizing Rome and another house of the same order following Avignon. Parish priests found themselves navigating parishioners' doubts, especially in border regions where loyalties were mixed. Pilgrimages to Rome or Avignon carried political as well as devotional meaning, signaling not just piety, but also allegiance. Urban VI's governance in Rome was marked by an increasingly autocratic style. His suspicion of the cardinals, especially those with French ties, led him to appoint a new slate of mostly Italian members to the college. This alienated not only Avignon supporters, but also moderates who might have sought reconciliation. Clement VII, meanwhile, cultivated a more conciliatory court in Avignon, drawing on the administrative traditions developed during the earlier Avignon Papacy. His proximity to the French crown gave him resources and protection, but it also fueled the perception among his opponents that he was a papal captive to French interests. The schism's psychological toll on Christendom was immense. For centuries, the papacy had been the unifying center of Western Christianity, the final arbiter in disputes of doctrine and governance. Now that unity was visibly broken, preachers spoke of the Church as a body with two heads, a monstrous image that underscored the unnaturalness of the division. Some prophets and visionaries interpreted the schism as a sign of the end times, while others saw it as divine punishment for the Church's moral failings. Despite these tensions, both papal courts functioned with a degree of normalcy that made the schism seem in some ways sustainable. Years passed without resolution, and the extraordinary became ordinary. Children were born into a world where the Pope was a term that always required clarification. Which Pope? This normalization of division was perhaps the most corrosive aspect of the schism, for it eroded the expectation that unity was the natural state of the Church. In the Rhone Valley, Clement's court glittered, much as it had in the days of Clement VI, though with fewer resources and greater caution. In Rome, Urban's court carried the weight of apostolic tradition, its ceremonies and proclamations ringing through the basilicas with an air of defiance. Both sides claimed the mantle of Peter, both prayed for victory, both excommunicated the other. The phrase "one Christendom" had once been a matter of identity. After 1378, it became an aspiration, and one that seemed, with each passing year, more remote. The two thrones, in Rome and Avignon, stood as enduring symbols of a wound in the heart of the Church, a wound that would take nearly 40 years to heal. What began as a contested election hardened into two obediences, each throne a mirror to the other. By 1380, the map of obedience had settled into lines that were as much political as devotional. France, Scotland, and much of Iberia recognized Avignon. England, most Italian states, and the princes of the Holy Roman Empire stood with Rome. Two papal signatures, two great seals, two rival calendars of feasts and fasts gave Christendom a double heartbeat. The extraordinary had become ordinary. Every petition needed specifying. To which pope? And every oath of fealty implied a second oath against the other. In Avignon, Clement VII worked within the administrative rhythms honed since Benedict XIII and Clement VI, audiences in frescoed halls, bulls penned in an orderly chancery, cardinals housed in handsome residences along streets that still remembered the curious golden years. In Rome, Urban VI and then Boniface IX leaned on the weight of apostolic place, basilicas that held the tombs of Peter and Paul, processions that wound beneath ancient arches, and a city that insisted the sea's authority flowed from the Tiber as surely as from Scripture. The split touched parish doors. In borderlands and trading towns, a traveler might find two notices pinned to the church porch, indulgences promulgated from different papal courts, each bearing a familiar leaden seal but different names. Confessors faced uneasy questions. If absolution comes by faculties granted from Avignon, does Rome receive the penitent as reconciled? If a marriage is licensed under Rome, will an Avignon court recognize its validity? The faithful lived with a new kind of uncertainty, spiritual and practical at once. Princes did not hesitate to make the most of it. Each obedience became for rulers a lever, recognition traded for privileges, taxes tempered in exchange for support, benefices promised to cousins and clients. The papal fisc showed the strain. Two courts meant two treasuries and duplicated diplomacy. In Florence and Bruges, merchants joked that the bills of exchange had learned to cross themselves twice, lest the wrong pontiff's collectors arrive first. Yet the schism was not merely an accounting problem, it was a question of principle. The University of Paris offered 3 ways to heal the rupture. Via sessionis, both popes resign. Via compromissi, submit to arbitration, or via concilii, appeal to a general council. None appealed to the incumbents. Clement feared that yielding to a council would let kings make of popes what the kings pleased. Urban and Boniface fretted, rightly, that resignation would brand their line as pretenders forever. So the years lengthened, and 2 obediences dug in. The dissonance reached monasteries and mendicant houses. One Franciscan province prayed for Clement's health at Compline. Another, a week's journey away, inserted Urban's name in the same place. Dominicans trained in Bologna debated with friars trained in Paris over which bulls bound their consciences. At Easter, some regions heard the Paschal proclamation on different dates, their computus aligned to rival almanacs sanctioned by Rome or Avignon. It was a small detail, a quirksome footnote to scholars, but to villagers it meant the village feast, and the spring sowing could fall out of step with cousins 2 valleys over. Coins, too, told the tale. Mints struck pieces bearing the effigy of their pope. Pilgrims learned to read not only the image, but the legend around the rim to avoid offense at the wrong altar. A notary in Lucca kept 2 formularies on his desk, one keyed to Roman chancery practice, the other to Avignon, his scratch marks in the margins a quiet map of Europe's split mind. Theologians carried their questions into the lecture halls. If the church is the mystical body, what is a body with 2 heads? A monster, said some. A scandal, permitted only by God's patience. Others replied that the head remained one, Christ himself, and that rival bishops of Rome were a chastisement, not a definition. Behind such debates stood a practical dread. What if sacraments performed under one obedience were later judged null? Most canonists found pastoral ways to avoid such cruelty, but the anxiety gnawed. Meanwhile, The Papal States, those stubborn patches of central Italy, became the stage for proxy war. Urban's Curia fought to hold Perugia and the Romagna. Clement sought allies in the south, where Queen Joanna I of Naples favored Avignon until her fortunes turned. Condottieri switched banners with their pay, and peasants learned to listen for the dialect of the tacksman to know which obedience currently claimed their fields. Amid the tension, symbols multiplied. Preachers likened the church to a bridge with a missing span, its arches rising nobly on both banks, while wagons piled up at the chasm. Scribes drew two keys in their margins, not crossed as on Peter's arms, but parted, like lovers sundered, each key turned away from the other. In tapestries, artists hid twin thrones behind a single altar, a house divided in thread. And still the rivalry continued with a strange normalcy. Letters arrived stamped Rome or Apud Avignonem. Ambassadors packed for one court or the other according to the season, and children were baptized under one obedience and married under the other without ever leaving their parish. Years taught resignation. The extraordinary had become the weather. But resignation is not peace. The longer the split held, the more scholars and princes returned to the old remedy of the ancient church, a council. If no single pontiff could call all of Christendom, perhaps Christendom could call itself. The thought was dangerous and bracing at once. To some it tasted like rebellion. To others it felt like medicine. Either way, the idea moved from disputations to dinner tables. By the decade's end, a conclusion pressed in. The two obediences could not bargain their way to one throne without a stage larger than either court. The church would need a chamber broad enough to seat the quarrel itself, a conciliar bridge sturdy enough to bear the weight of crowns and croziers together. And on the far side of that bridge, if it could be built at all, waited the hope of a single Paschal calendar and one shepherd's name spoken again at Compline. By the early 1390s, and foreshadowed by the bold but doomed Council of Pisa in 1409, the Western Schism had settled into an uneasy stalemate. Urban VI in Rome had been succeeded by Boniface IX, while Clement VII continued his rule in Avignon. Each pontiff acted as though the other did not exist, yet each was forced to contend daily with the fact that his authority was contested across half of Christendom. It was in this climate that murmurs began to grow, not of choosing between the two popes, but of replacing them both. The idea was not entirely new. From the earliest months of the schism, some scholars and clerics had suggested that a general council of the church might serve as a neutral arbiter. Councils had settled disputes in earlier centuries, though never one on this scale. Theologians in Paris, particularly at the University of Paris, were among the most vocal proponents of what came to be known as conciliarism, the belief that a council representing the universal church could act with authority above that of the Pope in certain extreme circumstances. To supporters of conciliarism, the schism was precisely such a circumstance. The division had already lasted more than a decade, and both popes showed no willingness to resign. If unity could not be restored by diplomacy or mutual abdication, perhaps it could be imposed by the collective judgment of the Church's bishops and theologians. The model often cited was the Council of Vienne in 1311-1312, the same council that had suppressed the Knights Templar under Clement III. The precedent cut both ways. It proved that councils could act decisively, but also that their decisions could be shaped by political forces. In Avignon, Clement VII regarded the conciliarist movement with suspicion, seeing in it a potential erosion of papal supremacy. To acknowledge a council's authority over a reigning pope would set a precedent dangerous to the office itself. In Rome, Boniface IX was no more inclined to welcome the idea. Both obediences preferred to negotiate from strength rather than submit to a forum they could not fully control. Yet the conciliar idea spread, carried by scholars, bishops, and secular rulers, frustrated by the diplomatic deadlock. The French crown, weary of financing the Avignon court and mindful of domestic unrest, began to see a council as a way to end the costly division without conceding outright defeat. In the Holy Roman Empire, King Wenceslaus IV lent cautious support to the notion, though his own political troubles limited his ability to act decisively. For secular monarchs, the schism had long been both an opportunity and a burden. It allowed kings to extract concessions from their pope in exchange for loyalty, but it also complicated diplomacy, trade, and ecclesiastical appointments across borders. Divided Christendom was not a stable Christendom, and the longer the schism persisted, the greater the risk that a third claimant might arise, a possibility whispered about but rarely voiced openly. The Crown of Aragon faced its own dilemma. Its territories stretched across regions where loyalties were split, from Valencia's Roman allegiance to Catalonia's Avignon sympathies. Balancing these factions required political finesse, and any shift in papal recognition risked upsetting the fragile cohesion of the realm. In England, meanwhile, the schism was intertwined with the 100 Years' War. Support for Rome was as much a statement of resistance to French influence as it was a theological conviction. Among the clergy, the schism produced a patchwork of obedience even within single orders. The Franciscans in one province might follow Rome, while their counterparts in another recognized Avignon. The Dominicans, whose intellectual centers included Paris and Bologna, often found themselves debating the merits of each claim as part of their theological curriculum. This diversity of allegiance was not without strain, as monks and friars traveling between houses had to navigate the political implications of their obedience. Conciliarists argued that the Church, as the mystical body of Christ, could not endure indefinitely with two heads. Some theologians took the metaphor further. A body with two heads was a monster, unnatural and unsustainable. If the popes would not step down voluntarily, it was the duty of the bishops, gathered in council, to act as surgeons and remove the source of the malady. But theory was easier than practice. Calling a council required agreement on its legitimacy, and in a divided church, no single authority could summon the whole without being accused of partiality. Each pope feared that attending a council convened by the other supporters would undermine his own claim. The stalemate deepened. In 1394, Clement VII died in Avignon. His electors, rather than seizing the opportunity to end the schism by declining to choose a successor, elected Cardinal Pedro de Luna of Aragon, who took the name Benedict XIII. Benedict was an able theologian and a man of strong will, but his election dashed hopes for a quick resolution. The Roman line continued under Boniface IX, and the division persisted unabated. Benedict XIII soon found himself at odds even with his own French protectors. In 1398, the French crown withdrew its obedience, besieging him in the papal palace at Avignon in an effort to force his resignation. For 5 years, Benedict was effectively a prisoner within the city's walls, maintaining his claim but unable to exercise it freely. The episode demonstrated both the power and the danger of royal influence over the papacy, a reminder that the schism was as much about crowns as about croziers. In Rome, Boniface IX pursued a policy of consolidating the papal states and strengthening the Roman curia's finances, often through the sale of offices and indulgences. These measures brought in much-needed revenue but also fueled criticism of corruption, a charge that would echo loudly in later centuries. Boniface's firm grip on the Roman See meant that he had little incentive to risk his position through conciliar compromise. By the turn of the century, the conciliar movement had gained intellectual legitimacy, but lacked the political muscle to compel action. Still, its advocates continued to press their case, producing treatises that circulated in the courts of Europe and laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the Councils of Pisa, 1409, and Constance, 1414-1418. The dream of a single, unified Christendom under one pope remained just that, a dream, but it was a dream that now had a blueprint. The image of three crowns began to appear in polemical literature, the royal crowns of Europe, each with its own interest in the schism, the triple tiara of the Pope in Rome, and the matching triple tiara of the Pope in Avignon. Together they formed a triangle of power, each corner tugging at the others, each preventing the balance that medieval Christendom had long taken for granted. As the 15th century approached, the schism seemed less a temporary crisis than a new reality. Yet the conciliarists refused to accept permanence. Their vision of a council to heal the division was, in some ways, a legacy of earlier moments when the Church had acted decisively. Moments like the suppression of the Templars, moments when unity had been preserved by difficult choices. The question now was whether such unity could ever be restored when both crowns and croziers had learned to live in the shadow of division. They would try at Pisa, and the bridge they built carried a third crown. By the early 15th century, the once proud papal city of Avignon was a place caught between grandeur and decline. Its towering palace still loomed over the Rhone, the angular Gothic walls catching the Provençal light in the same way they had when Clement VI held glittering court there. But the sound that filled those halls was no longer the bustling rhythm of the curia. The laughter of courtiers, the chatter of scribes, and the measured footsteps of ambassadors had given way to echoing emptiness, punctuated by the occasional creak of timber or the flutter of pigeons nesting where diplomats once walked. Avignon's decline was tied directly to the stubborn persistence of the Western Schism. Benedict XIII still claimed the papal title from within the Palais de Pape, but his legitimacy had shriveled. The French crown, which had once been the Avignon papacy's most stalwart protector, had withdrawn its support in 1398, besieging Benedict in the very palace that had once been a symbol of papal security. Though the siege lifted in 1403 and Benedict reasserted control over the city, the damage was irreversible. Many of his former cardinals had deserted him, and his influence was reduced to a handful of loyal territories, parts of Aragon, Navarre, and the small but persistent enclave of Scotland. The Avignon papacy had always been something of an anomaly, a seat of Peter in exile, as its detractors put it, or a pragmatic relocation, as its defenders argued. In its prime, it had been a center of diplomacy, art, and administration. Now it was an island, cut off from the wider currents of European politics. Its court, a skeleton crew, sustained more by habit than by power. The physical fabric of Avignon reflected this transition. Streets that had once been filled with merchants catering to papal officials, scribes selling parchment, goldsmiths crafting ceremonial plate, taverns serving wine to visiting clerics, saw fewer customers. The Rhone still carried barges laden with goods, but fewer of them were bound for the papal kitchens. Inns that had hosted bishops now stood half empty, their owners recalling better years when the city thrummed with the business of Christendom. Yet the city did not collapse entirely. The memory of papal grandeur had left Avignon with an infrastructure, fortified walls, the mighty bridge of Saint-Benazet, the vast palace that could still command awe. Pilgrims continued to arrive, drawn by the city's relics and its place in the long, tangled history of the papacy. Local rulers sought to preserve its status as a cultural and economic center, even if its role in church governance had been reduced to a stubborn echo of former days. Benedict XIII himself was a paradoxical figure in this waning chapter. Highly educated and fiercely principled, he refused to abdicate despite mounting pressure from both secular rulers and churchmen. He styled himself as the guardian of true papal authority, convinced that to step down would be to betray the office of Peter. His refusal earned him admiration from a small circle of loyalists, but also deepened the frustration of those who saw his intransigence as the primary obstacle to unity. By 1409, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Council of Pisa, convened by cardinals from both obediences, attempted to end the schism by deposing both Benedict XIII and Gregory XIII of the Roman line. In their place, they elected Alexander I. Instead of restoring unity, the council had created a third papal claimant, turning the schism into the farce many had feared. 3 popes, each excommunicating the others, each issuing bulls and blessings, as though his was the only voice of the Church. For Avignon, the Council of Pisa was a devastating blow. The election of Alexander III signaled that the wider Church had little confidence in either of the 2 long-standing obediences. Benedict's position became even more precarious. He slipped the siege in 1403, briefly regained recognition, then shifted his dwindling court west, eventually holding out at Peñíscola on the Spanish coast, a rocky promontory rising from the Mediterranean like a last redoubt. From there, he continued to claim the papal title until his death in 1423, though by the final years, his obedience was little more than a legal fiction. The departure of Benedict XIII marked the true end of the Avignon papacy. The Palais des Papes stood empty of pontiffs, its great halls repurposed for more mundane uses. Over the decades, portions of the palace would be occupied by local governors, garrisoned by troops, and even used as a prison. The grand frescoes faded, the stonework weathered, and the vast spaces that had once echoed with the deliberations of Christendom's most powerful prelates became haunted by absence. Avignon itself adapted, as cities do. Freed from the political entanglements of hosting a papal court, it shifted toward a regional role, serving as a center of commerce and local governance within Provence. The Rhone remained its lifeline, and the memory of its papal era became a point of civic pride, retold in chronicles and celebrated in festivals. Yet even in these moments of remembrance, there was an undercurrent of melancholy, the sense that Avignon had been touched by a singular moment in history that would never return. The ruin of Avignon's papal prestige also held symbolic weight far beyond Provence. For those in the Roman obedience, it was a cautionary tale. The papacy could not thrive in exile without losing its moral authority. For others, it was a reminder of the fragility of all human institutions, even those claiming divine sanction. The schism had not only divided the Church, it had reduced one of its most magnificent capitals to a relic of what might have been. And yet, for a generation of Europeans, the image of Avignon remained linked with the grand pageantry of the Church at its height. Travelers from Italy, England, and the Empire would still pause before the great walls and imagine the days when popes had walked beneath their shadow, when ambassadors had crowded its gates, and when the decisions made within its halls could shape the fate of kingdoms. In this way, Avignon lived on, not as the seat of Peter, but as a memory both glorious and bittersweet. The Western Schism would eventually end, but the ruin of Avignon as a papal city was permanent. What remained was stone and story, an empty throne by the Rhone, and the lesson that even the mightiest walls cannot guard against the slow erosion of legitimacy. In the quiet of its abandoned chapels, one might almost hear the distant echo of Latin prayers fading into the Provençal air. By the second decade of the 15th century, the Church had been fractured for over 30 years. 3 popes now claimed the tiara: Gregory XIII in Rome, Benedict XIII in exile at Peniscola, and John XXIII in Pisa, successor to Alexander Pfeffer from the ill-fated Council of Pisa. Each maintained a small circle of loyalists, but none commanded the universal obedience the papacy had once taken for granted. The triple papacy was more than an embarrassment. It was a threat to the very credibility of the Church. Into this crisis stepped the Council of Constance, convened in 1414 in the imperial city of Constance, on the shores of Lake Constance. It was called under the authority of King Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire and Pope John XXIII. Though once assembled, the council quickly asserted its own supremacy over all 3 claimants. This was conciliarism in its boldest form, a general council declaring that in matters of urgent necessity, its authority could stand above that of any pope. The scale of the gathering was unprecedented. Contemporary estimates put the attendance at more than 30,000 people, including bishops, abbots, theologians, princes, ambassadors, and the retinues that accompanied them. Streets and squares filled with a babel of languages, Latin for official proceedings, but also French, German, Italian, Czech, and English in the informal exchanges. Merchants thrived on the influx, selling everything from fine silks for clerical robes to barrels of wine for the endless banquets and negotiations. The first order of business was the schism. John XXIII, having convened the council, soon realized that it might not serve his interests. In March 1415, fearing deposition, he fled Constance in disguise. His escape caused a sensation, but it also sealed his fate. The council declared him deposed in May, citing charges of simony, immorality, and general unfitness for office. Gregory XIII, the Roman Pope, took a different path. In July 1415, he formally resigned, an act that historians often credit as one of the most selfless in papal history. By stepping down voluntarily, Gregory lent legitimacy to the council's authority and cleared the way for a resolution. His resignation was carefully staged. He first authorized the council to act in his name, ensuring that his obedience could claim to have summoned the very body that would end it. Benedict XIII was the most intransigent. Safe within his fortress at Peniscola, he refused to abdicate, insisting that he alone was the legitimate successor of Peter. The council sent delegations to negotiate, but Benedict stood firm, supported only by a dwindling circle of followers in parts of Spain and Scotland. In July 1417, the council declared him deposed, though Benedict would continue to claim the papacy until his death in 1423. With all three claimants removed or discredited, the council moved to elect a new, universally recognized pope. On 11 November 1417, after elaborate preparations to ensure fairness and avoid factional dominance, the conclave chose Cardinal Oddone Colonna of Rome, who took the name Martin V. His election was greeted with celebration across much of Europe. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the Church had a single pope. The Council of Constance did more than resolve the schism. It also addressed pressing issues of reform, though its record here was mixed. Decrees were passed affirming the superiority of general councils in certain circumstances, a direct challenge to the principle of absolute papal monarchy. These conciliar decrees would later be contested, but in the moment, they reflected the deep desire to prevent another schism. The council also sought to regulate papal elections, curb simony, and reform clerical discipline. Yet the council is perhaps equally remembered for its handling of heresy trials, most famously that of Jan Hus, the Czech reformer who had been promised safe conduct to Constance. Hus was arrested, tried, and ultimately burned at the stake in July 1415, his execution causing outrage in Bohemia and sowing the seeds of the Hussite Wars. This episode revealed the limits of the council's commitment to reform. While it sought to heal the institutional church, it remained intolerant of theological dissent that threatened its authority. Martin V faced the enormous task of restoring papal prestige after decades of division. He worked to reassert Rome as the unchallenged seat of the papacy, refurbishing churches, re-establishing the curia, and negotiating with rulers who had grown accustomed to leveraging papal weakness. His reign marked a return to the old order in many respects, but the memory of the schism lingered, and the conciliar movement remained a potent, if contested, idea in church politics. For Avignon, the council's verdict was final. No serious attempt was made to revive the papal court there, and the Palais de Pape entered its long afterlife as a fortress and administrative center. The Rhone still flowed past its walls, but the days when it carried the barge of a newly elected pope were gone forever. In Rome, the end of the schism was marked by ceremony and relief, but also by the quiet acknowledgement that something had been lost. The papacy had survived, but its aura of unassailable unity had been broken. The precedent of multiple popes and of a council deposing them could never be entirely erased from memory. The Council of Constance thus stands as both a triumph and a cautionary tale. It restored unity, but at the price of reinforcing the idea that papal authority could be judged and curtailed by the wider church. It ended the schism, but it also revealed the deep fissures, political, cultural, and theological, that had made the schism possible in the first place. And in the background, like a ghost at the edge of the council's grand processions, the memory of earlier papal crises lingered. Some chroniclers in Constance recalled the fate of the Templars a century earlier, another moment when the papacy had been tested and found wanting. In both cases, the lesson was the same. The unity of Christendom, once broken, could be restored, but never without scars. When Martin V finally made his way to Rome in 1420, he entered a city that welcomed him with both joy and guarded expectation. The schism was over, but the shadow it had cast would stretch far into the future. When Martin V entered Rome on September 28, 1420, the city had not seen a universally recognized pope for nearly 4 decades. The streets were lined with clergy in embroidered vestments, noble families adorned their palazzi with banners, and the bells of every church rang in unison. From the steps of St. Peter's Basilica to the narrow alleys of Trastevere, the arrival of the new pope was staged as a restoration, not just of a ruler, but of the city's destiny as the heart of Christendom. Rome itself, however, was in poor condition. Years of political instability had left its walls in disrepair and its streets neglected. The Lateran Palace, once the center of papal administration, had suffered from both neglect and the occasional plundering of rival factions. The basilicas, too, showed the marks of time: fading frescoes, crumbling mosaics, and roofs in need of repair. Even St. Peter's, the great symbol of apostolic authority, had visible cracks and sagging beams. Martin V understood the importance of appearances. The unity restored at Constance would mean little if the seat of that unity looked like a relic of better days. One of his first acts was to begin restoring the infrastructure of Rome. Streets were repaved, aqueducts repaired, and churches refurbished. Artists and craftsmen were invited to embellish chapels, repair altarpieces, and produce new liturgical treasures. New ledgers opened in rooms where old ones had burned, and chancery tables once more filled with the whisper of quills. These efforts were as much political as devotional. A Rome renewed in stone and marble was a Rome that could once again command respect. The Pope also worked to re-establish the papal court as the administrative hub of the Church. Curial offices that had been scattered during the schism were called back to Rome, and cardinals were encouraged to reside there rather than in their native sees. The city became, once more, the meeting place for ambassadors and the center of ecclesiastical decision-making. Yet beneath the ceremonies and restorations lay deep wounds. The schism had fundamentally altered the way rulers and subjects alike viewed the papacy. The notion that there could only ever be one pope had been shattered. The historical memory of 3 competing claimants lingered in every negotiation with secular powers. Kings who had grown accustomed to exploiting papal weakness were reluctant to surrender their influence. Concordats, formal agreements between the papacy and individual kingdoms, became tools for balancing authority, often granting monarchs a say in ecclesiastical appointments within their realms. The scars of the schism were also theological. The Council of Constance had affirmed, in its decree Haec Sancta, that a general council held authority directly from Christ, and that all, including the Pope, were bound to obey it in matters of faith and reform. While Martin V did not reject this outright, he maneuvered to avoid giving it binding force on future papacies. He knew that conciliarism, if left unchecked, could be wielded against his successors just as it had been used to resolve the schism. In the universities, debates about papal supremacy versus conciliar authority continued long after Martin's coronation. Scholars in Paris, Cologne, and Prague wrestled with the question of whether the events at Constance were an extraordinary necessity or a precedent for regular governance. Some argued that the schism had shown the dangers of unchecked papal power. Others insisted that the Church could not function if councils claimed the right to depose popes at will. Among the faithful, trust in the papacy had been shaken. Pilgrims still came to Rome, but many did so with a more pragmatic piety. Relics and indulgences drew crowds, yet the underlying sense that the Pope was the unchallenged shepherd of all Christendom had been diminished. The schism had created a generation for whom papal legitimacy was not self-evident but subject to political circumstance. Martin V also faced the delicate task of reconciling those who had supported the deposed popes. In Aragon, pockets of loyalty to Benedict XIII's memory persisted, and in Scotland, some clergy remained wary of Roman authority. These divisions were gradually mended through diplomacy, appointments, and the careful distribution of favors, but they served as a reminder that unity on paper did not always mean unity in the heart. The restoration of Rome's authority was further complicated by the state of the Papal States. During the schism, local lords and condottieri had expanded their power, seizing lands and asserting independence. Martin V had to negotiate, and at times fight, to reassert papal control. His efforts to rebuild the Papal States were as much about securing the Church's temporal base as about projecting spiritual leadership. Still, there were moments when the renewal felt tangible. In 1423, the Jubilee year brought thousands of pilgrims to Rome, their processions filling the streets from dawn to dusk. The city's churches glowed with candlelight, choirs sang in multiple tongues, and the bridges over the Tiber became rivers of humanity. The sight of so many gathered under one pope was a powerful counter-image to the years of division, a living testament to the possibility of restored unity. Yet even in these moments of triumph, observers noted the undercurrents of change. The schism had taught European rulers that the papacy could be pressured, manipulated, and even replaced. It had shown theologians that councils could claim supreme authority in a crisis. It had taught ordinary believers that the unity of the Church could fracture along lines of politics and geography. None of these lessons would be easily unlearned. For Rome itself, the return of the Pope was both a revival and a challenge. The city had to balance the demands of being a spiritual capital with the realities of being a political one. Martin V's reign marked a careful dance between reasserting papal sovereignty and acknowledging the new limits of papal influence in a Europe forever changed by the schism. By the time of his death in 1431, Martin had succeeded in re-establishing Rome as the papal seat and restoring a measure of dignity to the office. But he had not undone the deeper consequences of the schism. The idea that the Church could be governed by a council, the memory of competing popes, and the political habits formed during decades of division remained alive. The restoration was real, but the wounds were unhealed. In the soft light of the Roman evening, as the Tiber reflected the domes and towers of the city, one could see both the grandeur and the fragility of what had been reclaimed. Rome was again the heart of Christendom, but it was a heart that bore the scar of a long and bitter fracture, visible only to those who remembered how it had been broken. And when the bells quieted, another sound returned, the faint stir of ash and parchment, the Templars speaking again from the margins. When Martin V's reign brought a measure of stability to the Church, it also created space for reflection. The years of schism had been filled with immediate political crises, negotiations, alliances, rival claims, but unity restored allowed scholars, chroniclers, and preachers to look backward, weaving the long arc of history into their understanding of the present. In this backward gaze, the story of the Knights Templar emerged once more, refracted through the lessons of division. For more than a century, the Templars had been a cautionary tale about the dangers of political interference in sacred institutions. Their suppression in 1312 under Pope Clement V in Avignon had been shaped by the demands of Philip IV of France. Even during the height of the schism, partisans had invoked the Templar trials to bolster their arguments. Rome's supporters claimed the Avignon papacy had bowed to secular power, while Avignon's defenders argued that Clement had acted to preserve unity. Now, in a unified church, the memory of that controversy took on a different tone, not a weapon in factional rhetoric, but a reminder of what could happen when the balance between spiritual authority and political necessity was lost. In the sermons of the 1420s and 1430s, preachers sometimes drew parallels between the schism and the Templar suppression. Both had involved contested claims to moral authority. Both had seen the papacy act under intense external pressure. And in both cases, the outcome had left lingering doubts that no decree could fully erase. The moral lesson, as framed in these homilies, was that the Church must guard its independence fiercely, lest it become an instrument of temporal power. Chroniclers of the period often wove the Templar narrative into broader histories of Christendom. Poggio Bracciolini, the humanist secretary in Martin V's Curia, mentioned the Templars in his writings, treating them not simply as victims of royal ambition, but as part of the larger story of how papal authority had been tested across the centuries. In his telling, the schism was the latest and gravest trial, a rupture in the body of the Church comparable in symbolic weight to the destruction of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. This renewed interest in the Templars was not confined to scholars. Among the nobility, especially in France, Aragon, and Portugal, the romance of the order endured. Castles and commanderies once held by the Templars had passed to the Hospitallers or to secular lords, but their architecture, fortified walls, round chapels, carved crosses, still spoke of a vanished brotherhood. Visitors to these sites sometimes left offerings, as though honoring not just a military order, but a vision of chivalry untainted by politics. In Portugal, the Templar legacy had been transformed rather than erased. King Denis had refounded the order under a new name, the Order of Christ, in 1319, shielding it from the fate of its French counterparts. By Martin V's time, this order was deeply involved in the kingdom's maritime explorations, linking the Templar spirit to the new horizons of the Age of Discovery. To Portuguese chroniclers, this continuity was proof that the ideals of the Templars could survive even the harshest papal decrees, so long as they were adapted to new contexts. The idea of survival also took on a more mythic cast in popular imagination. Stories circulated of Templar treasures hidden during the trials, guarded by secret brotherhoods that still existed in shadow. In some versions, these hidden knights had waited through the long night of the schism, ready to serve the true pope once unity was restored. While historians dismiss such tales as folklore, their persistence revealed a deep longing for a form of loyalty and purity that many felt had been missing during the years of divided thrones. In the universities, the Templar case became a subject for legal and theological analysis. Canon lawyers debated whether Clement V's suppression of the order had been a lawful act of papal jurisdiction or an abuse of authority compelled by secular influence. The comparison to the Council of Constance's deposition of popes was unavoidable. If a council could judge and depose a pope, could it also be said that Clement had been, in effect, judged by the French crown. The symmetry was uncomfortable, suggesting that the balance between ecclesiastical and temporal power was always precarious. Martin V himself seems to have been aware of the symbolic resonance. While there is no record of him publicly invoking the Templars, his policies reflected a desire to prevent similar vulnerabilities. He worked to limit the direct interference of monarchs in ecclesiastical trials, reasserting the principle that clerics should be judged by church courts alone. His diplomacy with France and Aragon was careful, aimed at rebuilding trust without conceding the independence of the papal office. The visual arts also contributed to the subtle revival of Templar imagery. In illuminated manuscripts commissioned for noble patrons, miniature scenes sometimes depicted knights in white mantles standing at the margins of papal processions, perhaps as allegorical guardians of the Church, perhaps as echoes of a lost chapter in its history. In one Florentine manuscript of the 1430s, a pope is shown being crowned, with two shadowy knightly figures in the background holding a banner marked with a red cross. The image could be read as a reminder that unity was hard-won and must be defended. Among the common people, the connection between the Schism and the Templars often came through moralized storytelling. It was said in some French villages that the Church had once betrayed its own knights and had nearly betrayed itself during the Schism. These tales, passed along in taverns and marketplaces, reduced complex historical events to cautionary fables. Beware the arrogance of kings, beware the weakness of priests, and above all, beware the day when faith becomes a tool of politics. In this way, the memory of the Templars served a double function in a unified church. It was a historical case study for theologians and lawyers, a symbol in art and literature, and a moral parable for ordinary believers. The Schism had sharpened its meaning, turning it from a relic of early 14th century politics into a timeless reminder of the Church's vulnerabilities. By the end of Martin V's pontificate, these echoes were woven into the cultural fabric of Christendom. The Templars were no longer simply a dissolved order. They had become part of the language in which people spoke about unity, justice, and the relationship between the sacred and the secular. The unified church carried their ghost within its restored walls, a ghost that would reappear, in different forms, whenever the bond between spiritual authority and moral integrity was tested. And so, even in a Rome that glittered once more with processions and ceremony, the red cross of the Templars could still be glimpsed, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet margins of memory, where history waits to be remembered when the next storm comes. The Western Schism ended with a pope once more enthroned in Rome, but the shadows it cast lingered far beyond the lifetime of those who had lived through it. The palaces, bridges, and riverbanks of two cities, Avignon and Rome, stood as silent witnesses to a century of upheaval, each holding a different chapter of the same story. The Rhone and the Tiber had carried not just water, but the hopes, fears, and decisions that had shaped Christendom. In Avignon, the Palais des Papes remained the city's dominant presence. Its massive walls still caught the golden Provençal light at dawn, and its great halls still echoed, though now with the quieter sounds of local administration, civic gatherings, and, in time, curious travelers. The people of Avignon had lived for nearly 70 years with the Pope as their neighbor. For some, his absence was a relief. For others, it was like the empty chair at a table, a reminder of conversations and ceremonies that would never return. Local chroniclers recorded the city's transformation. They noted how the merchants who had once sold fine fabrics to cardinals now catered to provincial officials, how the grand processions that had once filled the streets on feast days were replaced by smaller, more local celebrations. Yet in memory and in stone, the papal era endured. The palace remained a monument to the idea that the papacy could be moved, that the seat of Peter was not fixed by geography alone. It was a physical rebuttal to the belief that Rome was the only possible capital of Christendom, an argument now muted, but never entirely silenced. In Rome, the papacy resumed its role as both spiritual and temporal ruler. The city's streets bustled with the business of the curia once more, and the basilicas drew pilgrims from across Europe. Yet the schism had left Rome with a more complex relationship to its own authority. It was no longer unthinkable that the Pope's legitimacy might be questioned, or that another city might host the papal throne. The papacy had been restored, but its mystique had been tempered by experience. For historians of the 15th century and beyond, the schism became a case study in the fragility of institutions. It showed that the Church's unity was not an immutable fact, but a condition that required constant tending. Through diplomacy, reform, and a careful balance between the demands of heaven and the realities of earth. The Templar suppression, remembered in the background of these events, offered a parallel, a reminder that the papacy's decisions could have consequences far beyond their immediate moment, shaping how future generations judged its integrity. Artists, too, found ways to weave the legacy into their work. In fresco cycles depicting the councils of the Church, painters often included symbolic rivers, two streams flowing apart and then joining again, to represent the division and reunion of Christendom. In Rome, the Tiber was painted broad and calm at the point of unity. In Avignon, the Rhone was shown narrower, more turbulent, as though the waters themselves had carried away the last vestiges of papal grandeur. Among the people, the schism settled into the realm of story. Grandparents told their grandchildren of the time when there were two and even three popes, each declaring the other a fraud. In some places, these stories were tinged with humor, portraying the popes as quarrelsome old men. In others, they were solemn warnings about pride, greed, and the dangers of division. In the marketplaces of Provence, it was said that the Rhone once bore the fisherman's ring, while in Rome, pilgrims whispered that Peter's keys wandered, but they found their way home. The legacy was also political. Monarchs had learned that the papacy could be bent to their purposes, at least for a time. Concordats and privileges negotiated during the schism became permanent fixtures of church-state relations. The balance of power had shifted subtly. While the Pope remained the supreme head of the Church, kings and princes now had both precedent and leverage when pressing for influence in ecclesiastical matters. In theological circles, the debate sparked by the schism continued for more than a century. Conciliarism did not vanish with Martin Fee's coronation. It re-emerged in later disputes, especially during the Council of Basel in the mid-15th century. Though ultimately sidelined, the principle that a council could act above the Pope lingered as a latent challenge to papal absolutism, a seed that would bear different fruit during the Reformation. For Avignon, the papal era became its defining historical chapter, attracting scholars and, in time, tourists who came to see the fortress palace and hear tales of the Babylonian captivity of the Church. For Rome, The schism was a cautionary memory, reminding each new pope of the dangers of leaving the city or allowing political pressures to dictate the papacy's location. The Templars' fate too hovered as a symbolic echo. Both they and the Avignon papacy had been undone in part by the interplay of spiritual authority and temporal ambition. And yet, there was a kind of quiet beauty in the way the story resolved. Two rivers, two cities, two thrones, brought back at last into one. The unity was imperfect, the scars visible, but it endured for the time being. For the people who walked along the Rhone at sunset, the palace rising like a shadowed memory behind them, or for those who stood on the Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome, watching the Tiber flow toward the sea, the lesson was the same. History is a current that can be divided, but that always seeks, in time, to rejoin itself. In the final measure, the schism's greatest legacy was not in the councils or decrees, but in the enduring awareness of fragility. The Church had survived, but it had been changed. Its unity was no longer a given. It was a task, one to be renewed in each generation. And like the rivers that had borne its triumphs and its exiles, it would always flow forward, carrying with it the memory of Avignon's long night and Rome's return to the morning light. Let the sword stay sheathed beneath the pine. Let the candles burn low in the chapel by the water. The Rhone and the Tiber still run, each in its own bed, each carrying the reflections of stone towers and ancient walls. And somewhere in the mingled sound of their waters, if you listen closely enough, you may hear the faint echo of Latin prayers, fading,